Okay, it's good afternoon from me here in the UK. It's 20 past 2 my time in the afternoon. Um, I'm just gonna discuss a few things about some of the content I've put up recently. So earlier this morning, I read an article about the NFL wanting to potentially take the Super Bowl to London from at least 2026 at the earliest. It's very, very interesting. Obviously, we've had the London series since 2007, which has now grown into the international series that we see today, which now spans two continents and three cities. And the growth of that international series from a one-off game in 2007 to an international series worth billions of dollars in revenues for the NFL over the best part of 14, 15 years now. And obviously, the plans originally to have a team in London and all that. It's very, very interesting. So we'll see if in 2026 or at some point after 2026, the NFL decides to have a Super Bowl in London. It's not just the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium where they could host a Super Bowl. There's multiple stadiums in London that meet Super Bowl capacity requirements and have the facilities available to host a Super Bowl. And yes, while the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium is one of the biggest stadiums in the country, um, and it's the most modern of the stadiums in London as well. There are some other stadiums which have hosted NFL games, and there are some other stadiums that are also multi-use, multi-purpose stadiums as well. Now, the article I read was published back in January. This is before this season's Super Bowl in Arizona. And of course, the next year's Super Bowl is in Las Vegas, and the one in 2025 is in New Orleans. And then after that, the NFL has not confirmed the next batch of cities to host one. But there's strong rumours circulating in the US sports media that there's the potential for the 2026 Super Bowl to be in London. And I discussed the possibilities behind that and the history behind that in the video. Then I did another video today looking at the number of English football clubs that have US investment or ownership. There's 23 in total that I found. That includes Wrexham in the National League, all the way up to the Premier League, where there's 10 currently. Will be 11 next season, should all the American-owned clubs stay up, and of course Burnley, who have got promoted. So it could be as many as 11 next season. In total, yeah, 23 out of the top 100 and what is it, 126 clubs or so in the top five leagues in English football. That's about 1/5 of the clubs in the top five divisions, including the National League, have American part or full ownership, which is just astounding. And the fact that half the Premier League currently has American ownership is also quite ridiculous as well. So that's a very striking stat that I did a bit of research on. Also, the Stanley Cup playoffs start next weekend. So the regular season has ended. Some big teams have missed out, the Washington Capitals and the Pittsburgh Penguins. The last time both those teams did not qualify for the playoffs was, I think, back in 2006. So that was Crosby's first season, and I believe Ovechkin's second season or first season in the NHL. So we've been very blessed that both Alexander Ovechkin and Sidney Crosby have had so many playoff appearances, postseason games, and 4 Stanley Cups between them. Very, very blessed as a generation to have their talent reaching the latter stages of the NHL playoffs. And so that's a big momentum swing. Now, we've seen a lot of coaching and general manager changes already, with some teams already axing coaches and GMs as soon as their seasons have ended. I think the coaching cull will continue during the playoffs as well, depending on how far certain teams get and such. And there's a lot of pressure on the Toronto Maple Leafs to get out the first round this year. They have a favourable, although the Tampa Bay Lightning are the top dogs at the moment in recent success with the amount of Stanley Cup finals they've had since 2015, the amount of silverware they've won. They're looking a little bit more vulnerable this season. And if Toronto do fail to get out the first round, is Carl Dubas and Sheldon Keefe are their jobs on the chopping block. Is Carl Dubas as GM, his job on the line? Is Sheldon Keefe's job as head coach on the line? Yeah, great regular season, postseason lack of success. That inability to get out of the first round is a problem. Do I think Bayern Munich have got worse under Tuchel? I think Bayern Munich, this is a down year for them. It didn't work under Nagelsmann either. I think that the Bayern Munich machine in Germany is starting to creak a little bit. I think the warning signs have been there with Munich for the last couple of seasons that their dominance of German football, at least, is starting to come to an end. They're in a very tight title race with Dortmund at the moment for the Bundesliga. League winners shield. And Tuchel, he was available. He is German. So there was no compensation payments to pay to another club to get him out of a contract, which is important. But I think the issues were already there under Nagelsmann. We now hear about the Sane-Mane incident, where there's clearly infighting with the squad. The squad isn't harmonious. And I think this is the first season they've been really challenged for the Bundesliga title in quite some time. So, and they're not winning in Europe anymore, in the sense of winning European silverware. So, there are other clubs in Germany that are now picking up domestic and European honours. I mean, I throw in Eintracht Frankfurt, for example, in there. They've been a renaissance team in recent seasons since 2018. They've picked up a bit of silverware. So it's not all one way traffic in Germany at the moment. And look, I did a video after the World Cup looking at Bayern Munich's dominance and the downturn in fortunes for the German national side since they won the World Cup in 2014, and I think there is a correlation there. So it's very, very interesting. Do I think have they got worse? I think the warning signs were already there. Same with Chelsea under Todd Bowley, and I think the warning signs were there under the last couple of years under Abramovich. That things at Chelsea with the playing side of things, the footballing side of things, at least there were warning signs there. Manchester United, is this another false dawn under Ten Hag with the League Cup win and their form in recent weeks since that League Cup triumph? And the battle for the top four. Yes, they go into an FA Cup semi-final next weekend, but I think Brighton could surprise them. I don't think they're dead sets to make the FA Cup final. I think Brighton are going to be very dangerous opposition for them, so they're not certain to make a second cup final this season. And of course, the Sevilla result, where all 4 goals are actually scored by United players. There are certain clubs where warning signs have been there for some time. I don't think they necessarily got worse under Tuchel. I think there needs to be a slight squad overhaul with Bayern Munich, and I think there is unrest in that dressing room, considering the Mane, Sane incident post-match following their Champions League defeat. Bayern need a Klopp style, not a Tuchel style. That's an interesting discussion point. I think the Klopp style of football may have run its course as well. Look at Liverpool's struggles in the last couple of seasons. And this season's been a disaster for Liverpool. Players have lost form. There's clearly an imbalance in the squad. Some of the signings haven't paid out as well as anticipated. There has been a lot of injuries. We will stress that. And his time finally running out with Klopp at Liverpool with his time there. It has been reasonably successful, not as successful as I think many Liverpool fans would have hoped, but they get that first league title in 3 decades. They win another Champions League. They won all the domestic honours. So there is a debate about how long Klopp has got left as Liverpool manager. There's debate about some of Liverpool's transfer policy, and obviously now Firmino is going to be leaving in the summer. They've lost Sana, they've lost Mane, so Salah's the only one of that front 3 left that brought them league success. Squad turnover, the balance of the squad, and the poor season they've had, very similar to Chelsea. And there are rumours surrounding the Fenway Sports Group. I mean, look at what they've done with their NHL team, the Fenway Sports Group. They failed to make the postseason for the first time in the 16 years with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Yes, they've only recently purchased the Pittsburgh Penguins as majority stakeholders, but a less than acceptable regular season, and they've sacked the general manager and the assistant general manager, and they've made sweeping changes with the management of the Pittsburgh Penguins. So the Fenway Sports Group don't hang around. But since they've been in, they have given Klopp time. But I think the Klopp style of football, while I do enjoy it, I think it needs to be tweaked, and you need the players to do it. Would the Bayern playing squad work with Klopp? Well, he's worked with Mane to great success. That doesn't mean some of the other players at Munich will buy into his philosophy and his style. There are some players within the Munich system that have played under Klopp at Dortmund prior, which I think could be a benefit should he go there. But Tuchel, he's a prickly character. We've seen it at his previous clubs. He does fall out with board members and directors of football and scouts, and the off-field side of things, transfer policy becomes an issue. Um, Now, the full details surrounding his departure from Chelsea, you know, uh, there was a breakdown in the communication and the trust between the new owners and over transfer policy and a whole host of other reasons why Tuchel is no longer Chelsea manager. Now, the fact that the Chelsea situation, they've gone back to Lampard, the guy who Tuchel replaced in the first place, just shows you the crisis of that football club and the direction that club's taken under Todd Bowley's majority ownership. Now, there are other people involved with the ownership of Chelsea, but Todd Bowley's the face of the ownership group. And their transfer policy hasn't really been coherent. The Graham Potter experiment didn't work. That's not to say Tuchel and Potter aren't bad managers. It's clearly been a disaster for Chelsea this season. And I always hark back to Brian Clough at Leeds United and that very disastrous spell he had there. He had success before at Derby and he had success following at Nottingham Forest. So good managers will have these rough spells. It's just interesting how the Tuchel era ended very abruptly at Chelsea, how Graham Potter's experiment clearly didn't work. It clearly wasn't the right choice of manager for the playing squad that was there, and that their transfer policy is really all over the place. There doesn't seem to be a direction with, okay, we'll just get the best player for the position we need rather than we'll just get any available player. So we'll see what happens with Chelsea with their pursuit of a full-time manager, because we know Lampard is there in an interim capacity. There's nothing to suggest he'll be given the job full-time. They haven't won a game under Lampard as of yet. And I think Lampard's identified there are issues there that do need fixing. Now, whether that he has some input on the summer transfer policy and who comes in to replace Potter full time will be another interesting side note. Now, I don't think Chelsea will end up getting relegated or getting dragged into the relegation battle. I don't think that's going to happen. I think there are multiple teams below them in the table that are clearly not as good as Chelsea with squad depth and how they're playing. So I think Chelsea possibly can get out of the situation and end up around, I would say, 10th or 11th is possibly where Chelsea are at this season. I think Chelsea fans, much like Man United fans before them, have got far too used to success. The Chelsea ownership model, which has always been the same, even going back to Ken Bates as chairman, was managers aren't given time at Chelsea. They're not. Their managers at Chelsea have a very short shelf life, regardless of the success that they bring to the club. Going back to the Vialli days and the Ruud Gullit days in the 90s, when Chelsea started to become a successful club again before the Abramovich era, managers weren't given time, regardless of the silverware they brought to the club. And that has continued under Abramovich and now under Todd Bowley. So that is an issue that I think hurts Chelsea. On the Liverpool side of things, as I say, the Fenway Sports Group, he is the only managerial appointment they have made since they have owned the club. Yes, they sacked his predecessor. They brought him in. They have backed him for a long time. I think he's the longest serving manager in the Premier League right now, is Klopp at Liverpool. So he has been given the time to build a philosophy, build a squad, build a style. Um, but in the last couple of seasons, there have been some red flags raised in regards to the performances and the results and some of the bad defeats that Liverpool have had. Now, yeah, he has had a very successful spell as a manager. I think they would have wanted to win more trophies, but in other seasons they would have won the Premier League at a canter. It just so happens that Man City at their peak were just slightly better on a more consistent period of time with their record-breaking seasons as well. Um, and Man City this season have also regressed as well, in my opinion. And with what's happening with Manchester City off the field, that could have a massive, massive impact on the Premier League going forward. Now, same with Everton off the field as well. There are several clubs in the Premier League that have off-field concerns that could impact the Premier League going forward in the off-season. Depending on the punishments given out to Manchester City and Everton for their financial dealings, and their financial breaches, it could have a very long lasting impact, not only on the Premier League, but English football in general. And then you look at the Championship and the Football League and some of the clubs there that are having financial issues off the field or breaches of financial rules. Reading is the example that is used this season in the Championship with their points deduction, but they're not the only club that have off field issues. Something needs to change drastically and soon. Because if the Football League and the Premier League and the FA are to fully implement their rules and punishments, around 70% of clubs in England, or in the English league system, should I say, would be punished by fines, points deductions, and transfer embargoes, or a mixture of all three, for being in breach of the financial fair play system and the rule and the financial spending rules and losses over profits rule. I mean, and we can't have that because it's bad luck for the poor governance that the game has had for a very, very long time in regards to club finances. Just cannot be allowed. So they cherry pick the clubs that they punish. So in this case, it's Man City, Everton, and this season Reading that are the ones under the microscope. In previous seasons, it was Derby County. Before then, Birmingham City had been under the microscope. Obviously, Portsmouth with their administration and their financial issues over the last 14 years. Sheffield Wednesday is another one. Multiple clubs have been not the flavour of the month, and they're the ones that have been made examples of at various levels of the footballing pyramid. Now, the news surrounding Man City and to a certain extent Everton has gone a bit quiet. I think Everton need to stay in the Premier League. If they get relegated, that is an absolute disaster for that football club, considering that the stadium build is going to cost money, parachute payments, the debts they've incurred. Manchester City, we've got to see what punishment they receive should they be found guilty of the charges that the Premier League and the FA have basically brought against them. And they're very similar to the UEFA charges brought against them, but there's been other charges added as well. And again, the consequences on Man City could be quite catastrophic. Um, and and that's something that needs to be noted and discussed. And it harks back to the. I mean, I know the government proposed legislation is a bit of a populist, piece of legislation. It's designed to carry popular favour with working and middle class people, saying that we do care about society in this country, and that's another political argument. And what is interesting is a lot of the Premier League clubs are opposed to it, including Manchester City and Everton, who are the ones falling foul of current footballing regulations. So, can you imagine an independent regulatory body? I mean, crikey, they would go after everyone. But it does raise the concern surrounding football governance and especially team finances and what happens off the field. Then we go to the Mitrovic situation where the FA are still are planning to appeal his 8-game suspension. I mean, he misses most of the rest of the season. I think he might play 1 or 2 games should his 8-game suspension stand. The FA are feeling that's too lenient. And then we see what happened with Robinson for Liverpool with the elbow from the official to the head, and that the FA is taking no further action. You can't have it both. You've got to have a fair system. But yeah, I think it's only a matter of time before the referees are fully mic'd up so the TV and audience at home and the fans in the stadium can hear. They do receive a lot of abuse. Yeah, take the fans out of it. They do receive a lot of abuse from players. I think that will reduce dissent um, from players in time. I think, and then those players, caught abusing officials verbally or physically will receive lengthier penalties. I think that is a matter of course. I think the FA and UEFA have to go, and possibly even FIFA have to go down this route because it. We always see these really distasteful scenes. Um, where World Cups and Euros and in the Champions League, the FA Cup, regular league games of players hounding the referee for a decision. It's just not a good look. The Women's Super League. Yeah, it's very interesting that the women's game over here in the UK, well in Europe, starts earlier than the women's game in Australia and New Zealand, which is very very striking. That the women's domestic season with the NRLW doesn't start, I think, until after the first match of Origin. So that's another 5, 6, 7 weeks. It's very very striking that in the northern hemisphere we start our regular season earlier than the southern hemisphere. That's very very interesting. Um, I'll have to give it a look at some point. Also, the Women's Six Nations as well is getting kind of interesting. But yeah, I'm a massive fan of women's rugby league and rugby union. When I get the opportunity, I do catch the occasional game, and it's very entertaining. It's very refreshing how they play the game. Um, and again, the debate about professionalism in the women's game will continue. You know, and it doesn't go away. It grows in strength. About women's sport and professionalism, and we can have a debate about that. I think, in my opinion as well, I think we need to have a War of the Roses type state of origin series in rugby league for both men and women. I do agree with that. It's not just in the women's game. I think in the men's game as well. I think that'd be fantastic. To watch, and I think could do a lot to bring in further revenue for the game. And a bigger TV audience for the game. I think that would massively benefit rugby league in this country. Look at the revenue and the TV audience for State of Origin in the NRL. Both nationally and internationally, it really draws in sponsors, TV audience, casual fans, and it leads to more people wanting to watch and play the game, not just domestically in Australia and New Zealand, but also further afield. Um, so yeah, I do think a War of the Roses type uh, state of origin uh, series like Yorkshire versus Lancashire, I think could do wonders for the game, both in the men's and women's. I think it's something um, that could be considered, and I'm not. I'm surprised the RFL haven't considered it. Hashtag United, yes, some of these what I would call pub teams. Yeah, hashtag United. I mean, look, obviously at some point, they will probably change their name or eventually get serious consideration for ownership. Um, but look at these new clubs. And when I say new clubs that have been founded within the last decade, 15 years, that are starting to really gain traction in the non-league and are looking at going up the league ladder into the football league. And the one I think that came close last year was Solihull Moors. They've only been a club, I think, since 2007. FC United of Manchester, they've only been a club since 2004. So some of these new clubs, you know, uh, are doing rather well in the lower levels of the English game. It's the same with AFC Wimbledon when they were reformed. They got back to the Football League very, very quickly. Um, so it's great to see the development um, of the lower, and it just shows that the game can still grow, even though it's a very established sport with an established league structure. It continues to have these positive signs of growth, alongside all the negative headlines of financial mismanagement, corruption, and all the negativity. Things like hashtag United or Solihull Moors and clubs like that have only recently come into existence, having the growth that they've seen and the drive behind it, and the community involvement's fantastic. Considering, I honestly believe the sport, both in this country and globally, is at a crossroads, and it's fantastic to see the momentum that's been picked up. Um, the fact that they're still like in the non-league, it will take a long time before they even get even close to the football league or even the national league for that matter. But the fact that they're going up the non-league levels at the rate they are is fantastic, considering they've only been around for a handful of years. Um, and that's the positive side of you know football and sport in general. The negative side, as I say, is where we have all these negative headlines of player misbehaviour, financial impropriety, poor governance, corruption. You know, lengthy suspensions for players and officials for actions on and off the field. All the negative headlines and all the scandal that keeps coming out about sport and the culture within sport, especially football. It's refreshing to see these positive, feel good stories come out, but the media don't really report them enough. The mainstream media does not report the positive aspects of sport and grassroots sport, where a bunch of mates have come together, formed a football club, and are going up the non-league ladder, aiming for the football league at some point. The mainstream media regularly ignores stories like that. Yeah, I mean, they will be playing a more established clubs, which obviously have a bit more financial clout behind them, that can afford to pay, should I say, some of their, even though they're classed as semi-professional, they've got professional players on their books, and so they're going to come up against a lot tougher opposition with better facilities, for example, more established in the local communities. They might even have a youth system and their community youth system. They can get professional players on loan from the Football League and the Premier League who are coming through academies or are playing in the lower levels to get game time. So it's going to be a tougher challenge for like hashtag United to get to the higher levels of the non-league where there's more professional clubs. But they've gained a momentum, and it's through that social media aspect of things where they gain that momentum. Obviously, the club's gained a momentum of its own. But as I say, that the mainstream media don't pick up on these feel-good stories. They don't promote these feel-good stories, whereas they always focus on scandal and sackings and player misbehaviour and corruption scandals and all the negative side of things. They're more focused on that and promoting negative stories than positive ones, because controversy with the mainstream media's logic for them is what gets the eyeballs on what they're writing, they're recording, they're discussing. So the mainstream media could actually do more, in my opinion, of selling these feel good stories at a time when the nation itself is going through a lot of negativity around, a lot of negative headlines. It's kind of refreshing to hear about clubs like hashtag United and last year's Solihull Moors having these really good seasons and doing really well. It's refreshing. It's like the Wrexham story with Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney and their ownership, and the story there, and the resurgence of that football club under their ownership, and how close they came to promotion last season, and how they're doing really, really well this season, and could win the National League outright. And again, not enough, I think, uh, with the mainstream media reporting is on the good stories. Oh yeah, Rising Ballers. They're another one. Yes. So you've got hashtag United and Rising Ballers. Less successful, less well known in social media circles and with the younger fans. But again, group of friends come together. This is how football clubs were, brought around in the Victorian times. By the way, was a group of like-minded people from a local community would come together and come up with an idea to found a football club or a rugby league club or a rugby union club or a cricket club or whatever you know team you want to think of. It was normally local people, be it a local businessman or people who worked in the same industry, would come together and go, "Shall we form a football club?" And they would go, "Yeah." And it's always the early days are community based. Now, it is important to note that while the names may have changed and how but the principle's there. It's formed by a group of like-minded people, um, and they've come up with a name, but at some point, they'll have to change the name to be a little bit more serious to gain traction. But a group of people have come together and founded a sports club. And it's generally how it works. Um, the manner behind it will be different with the technology we have and social media and all that, but it gains interest and people follow. Um, Talking about social media, by the way, I've got rid of my Twitter account. Looking at the channel analytics, it wasn't really assisting the channel in its growth, which is very interesting. And at the same time, um, I've been getting more and more frustrated. And talking about social media, I'm very frustrated with Twitter. I mean, especially in regards to sport. I mean, it really has become a very negative, toxic place over many years. It doesn't matter that Elon Musk is now the owner. And yeah, it's I got rid of my Twitter account. I may actually set up a Facebook account solely for the channel and the channel content to keep you know make that known, and get rid of my personal Facebook because it's got to a point now where I don't really use my Facebook to keep in contact with people. I just post silly memes and videos and then my YouTube content. So social media, my relationship with social media has changed, and I do think sport and social media, while hashtag United and Rising Ballers FC is a positive of social media in sport, what I've seen is mostly on the negative side of things, um, and it it's becoming more toxic as a platform. I think YouTube has done a lot in positivity in recent years to combat that toxic element. I think YouTube's made great progress in comparison to Twitter, a rival platform. Um, and yeah, that sport and social media and politics has all become very blurred. I mean, the NHL with the Pride controversy, the Manly Sea Eagles last year with their Pride controversy with the jerseys, that's become a toxic debating point, which is detracted from the fact that obviously want sport should bring people together in a community. Um, and that does highlight some issues within certain sports and within society in general, that there's still that element of discrimination, which we don't want. The same thing with racism as well, and sexism. There's still a lot more we can do. Uh, but the NHL has faced a lot of criticism over how it's handled some issues to do with their Pride warm-up jerseys and certain players not wearing the jersey and their reasonings behind it. And that became an absolute shower of excrement, should I say, on social media. Some of the comments, some of the divisiveness, there was no middle ground there. And that's something that I think people can say stuff on social media and not face consequences. Um, and a lot of people now say, look at the Grand National yesterday with those protesters. Well, I understand animal rights and making sure that horse racing is as safe as possible. There are going to be fatalities and injuries to horses and jockeys, and it happens. But unfortunately, the animal rights activists and those people who delayed the start of the Grand National, what I find really interesting with them is they don't protest at the Gold Cup week at Cheltenham. The King George, I think King George Chase at Kempton Park. They don't protest there. They don't protest outside the Derby or at Newmarket or Royal Ascot or the Welsh National, the Scott. They choose that one particular day to go, well, we don't like this, but they regularly disappear for the other 364 days of the year. So, and they don't want to really engage with the horse racing community and the equine industry and the rural communities that are reliant on the horse racing industry for jobs, income, and investment and infrastructure. They don't want to engage with these people. So automatically, that's again, social media became an absolute shower. And I was tempted to put down that the IRA couldn't stop the Grand National in '97. They just raced it a couple of days later, and I thought, no, there's no point because then that brings in another more political topic where people actually die on a regular basis because of terrorism. It's just not worth it. In regards to feel good stories like Ascot United locally, that's a fantastic story. Yes, they won their combined counties league, and they are playing the FA Vase. They're doing what Binfield did a season or two earlier. They're going to Wembley, which is fantastic as well. So that's another local club to me that's having a trip to Wembley, which is fantastic. And hopefully we see further. We've had Bracknell Town live in the FA Cup on TV, so we are seeing more focus put on football in my local area, at least, in a positive note. Obviously, the Reading situation with their points deduction and relegation threatened season is in sharp focus to that. So there's negativity surrounding Reading. The other football clubs in the Berkshire area and the local area doing much better and getting more positive headlines out of things, which is fantastic. And they could win at Wembley, which would be fantastic. And they've just got promoted, so that's some positivity for a local club. I used to do their bins, by the way, as well. So that's some positivity. Well, there's a lad I went to school with who played for one of their youth teams as well many years ago. So um, that's nice to have that positivity. Again, not enough. Or should I say the positive headlines are covered? It's always where can we find the negatives in the mainstream media? And I think that's another frustration that sports fans and yeah, they actually play inside the racecourse, not next to it. They're sort of part of the racecourse facility. I believe their ground is actually owned by the same people who own the racecourse, which is technically the royal family under another company as one of the royal family's properties. Um, their stadium, their little ground is tiny, but it's part of the racecourse facility. And when Royal Ascot takes place in the summer, it's used as an overflow car park. Because I used to work at Royal Ascot as well. I used to work at the racecourse, so I know where their ground is. I've been there. I used to work at the Ascot racecourse, so I know the facility very well. Um, it's by the mile-long start. So you've got Swindley Bottom and the mile start, and it's sort of in that little triangular space. There's also a golf course in the middle as well. So it's not just the race course. There's a football ground and a golf course that all share the same facility. Um, and it's fantastic that Binfield and now Ascot are having a trip to Wembley, and it's positive headlines for non-league football clubs, especially local clubs. To me, with what's going on at Reading and the negativity surrounding that football club and their points deduction and their precarious finances, and if they were to get relegated, the consequences that could the negative consequences surrounding Reading could be very catastrophic. But as I say, talking about sports finance and where the money comes from and investment. When I was researching the American owners in English football, I was stunned that about 1/5 of professional clubs in this country have American money in them. And it's not just the Premier League, it was really stunning, which also backs up the growth of the sport in the US. It's not just driven by the MLS, it's driven by the interest in not just the Premier League, but European football. And it's not just in the English league system that there's American money. There's American money in Scotland. There's American money on the continent of Europe as well. So it's not just um, the interest in the English league system where there's American interest. There's interest in most of the European leagues, which has helped spur the growth of the game domestically in the US. Now, if that can be translated into growing the MLS into a very stable product long term, which can challenge the likes of Major League Baseball, the NHL, the NBA, and the NFL for TV viewership, revenue, sponsorship, and investment. That's another question entirely, and maybe the upcoming World Cup in 2026, which the US is co-hosting, could go a long way into growing the sport in North America. Obviously, that's another debate to be had, and whether we'll see if that pans out. Now, again, that is another big debate that we need to have. Can the growth of the grassroots growth of the sport in the US predominantly, although in Canada as well, it's growing as well as a participation sport, not only with kids and teenagers at school, but also adults playing with rec teams. Can that growth be sustained when the league stops expanding and post World Cup? I mean, that's going to be the key moment. Is 2026 that summer? Can the growth of participation of football, or soccer as the North Americans would call it, um, that would be very interesting. Thoughts on Fulham's idea of charging £3 a season ticket to sit in the new stand from next season? Um, hmm, yeah, interesting that one. Obviously, we obviously know about inflation and how much that's impacted running costs. That's got to be taken into consideration. But I remember when Fulham were under Mohamed Al Fayed, when they were last properly in the Premier League on consistent seasons back to back. They were an established Premier League side that went to the Europa League final in 2010. And around that time, so just around the financial crisis all those years ago, they were one of the cheapest sides for a season ticket alongside Blackburn. They were I believe, the two cheapest sides for season tickets um, at the time. And that's like 14, 15 years ago. But I look at it, and that is massive inflation, stupid amounts of price inflation. Um, and people go, well, Arsenal's quite expensive. Arsenal's very, very similar for a season ticket. I do hasten to add that. I'm going to put that out there. Arsenal, a lot of the London clubs are very, very similar for season ticket prices. It's not cheap to be a season ticket holder for a London-based football club. It's not cheap. Just going to put that out there for the viewers. The fact £3,000 though, that is a massive markup from where they were a decade ago, if not a little bit more. That's like a 1,000% markup, because I remember when it was a couple £100 per season for a season ticket at Fulham in the Premier League. So it does show how the economics has completely changed. Now, they have spent a lot of money on the stadium in my lifetime. I think they've had a couple of redevelopments or work done on the stadium. There's been a couple of phases of development at Craven Cottage in the last 20 years. So that will be very, very interesting. I'm concerned about the price hikes. I understand with the cost of living, but that unless they've done their market research on the demographics of their fan base, and actually have a rough idea of average take home pay and where their fans, the catchment area of their fans, that is still a lot. Now Fulham and Chelsea, that part of London is quite wealthy, but that is a real huge chunk of that's basically 2 months' wages for me just for a seat. That's a real off-putting thing. This is where the average fan does feel very priced out. So if you're a family of four and you only want to have one season ticket, like say the dad, and you've got a couple of kids, maybe a young kid, wife maybe on maternity leave, should I say, or if you're a single parent, or let's say you're in the 18 to 30 party age group, as they call it, the 18-30 club kind of bracket. That's just priced a load of people out. So taking out the Fulham Kensington area of West London, I mean, Fulham has fans outside of London. I will hasten to add that. I do know a lot of Fulham fans who don't live in London. One of my managers is a Fulham fan. My brother-in-law is a Fulham fan. My brother he may be a paramedic. He's not on massive amounts of money. He's not on a lot more than me. He's got a mortgage to pay. He's got a lot more bills than I do to pay. And I mean, look, I live by myself. I can't afford a one match day ticket and the associated costs to go with to watch one game, let alone a whole season worth of home games. That is a lot of money. And look, the demographics of Fulham's fan base would be quite interesting. It'd be nice to hear from Fulham fans at some point what they feel on that. I would say that is quite a sizable chunk of change. I remember, as I say, when Fulham was a more affordable club to go and watch. Now, obviously, new owners, the stadium is bigger than what it was before. They have put a lot of money. The previous owners under Mohamed Al Fayed's ownership and the Khan family, the current owners, have spent a lot of money on expanding the capacity at Craven Cottage. I think it's been 2 phases of development at the stadium. They are on a limited site. Um, that is a lot of money. It'd be interesting to know what an average season ticket price would be, and how many of the average attendance, how many people in attendance are season ticket holders, and whether it's more casual fans who do those short term packages of games where you buy a handful of games or just go on the day. It'd be very very interesting to see the dynamic of their crowds. That would be very very interesting if we can work out what the breakdown of season ticket holders to buying couple of match packages to just turning up casual fans who turn up when they can afford it. It'd be very, very interesting to see that breakdown of the that kind of demographic of fans from the various how tickets are sold. Um, Sacramento Republic, yeah, they're doing quite well. That's quite nice to hear. That's positive for Dan. It'll be interesting to see if they end up do become an MLS side in Sacramento. That'll be very interesting to see if eventually that does come to fruition. They might have gone cold on expansion for now, but I don't see that being the end of the story. So we'll see what happens with Sacramento Republic. But it's a good solid start for them this in their season. Fulham doesn't have the fan base to do this. Clubs like Man United, Chelsea, Arsenal might be able to. I wouldn't say Fulham have got a small fan base. They get overlooked because of Chelsea next door. They get overlooked because of Arsenal and Tottenham, and to a certain extent Palace in London and West Ham, clubs that have been more established in the Premier League over a longer period of time that have more success. But I wouldn't say they have no fans. I mean, they have a side. I mean, they didn't have a large fan base while they expanded the stadium twice. So there is that. Um, I wouldn't say they don't have a tiny fan base. I wouldn't say that at all. Um, but it is interesting that from where they were before just around the financial crash, 2007, 2008, to where they are now for price of ticket. Yes, you have to factor in inflation, cost of living, and running costs of a club, but that is a sizable markup from where it was. I don't know what the season ticket was last season, and I don't know what the season ticket price was pre the latest round of development at the stadium. That's a lot of money. And considering until this season, the club was a bit of a yo-yo club as well. They couldn't establish themselves in the Premier League, but they were too good for the Championship. They've been very inconsistent under Saeed and Tony Khan's ownership. This is their first season under that ownership group that they've had back. They're going to have back-to-back Premier League seasons, and it'll be very interesting to see what they do next season. If they fall back to earth and they don't do as well as they've done this season, that could come back to haunt them, overpricing their fan base. I wouldn't say so. I think every London club right now does quite well for fans. Even Barnet in the non-league, I would say every London club has very solid fan bases. It's like father to son as well. It stays in family. If you are a Millwall fan, you're going to stay a Millwall fan. Your kids ain't going to support West Ham or Charlton, for example, or Palace. Your family, father to son, mother to daughter. You stay. It's within the family once you're born into it, basically. Um, I wouldn't say there's any. London's such a big, diverse city. There's no one club that I think struggles to attract fans. No. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, and I've come across football fans of almost every London club outside of London as well. So the catchment area isn't just London; it's the surrounding home counties. Then I think it's even more of a national and global reach with a lot of them as well, because London's such a cosmopolitan, multinational city with a global standing. You get people from all around the world who end up living. You might come from overseas, end up living in next to Charlton's ground or next to Millwall or in the Palace catchment area. You may be a foreigner. Then you tell your relatives back in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Europe. I've started following my local club where you already have that interest in the sport anyway. And then you go, oh, by the way, when you come visit, I'll take you to a home game of Charlton Athletic or Brentford or whatever it may be. I've never heard of clubs failing to attract fans, but there have been clubs with financial issues off the field because of how the clubs are run. It's not because the fans don't care about the club; it's the off-field issues. So Charlton, the old Wimbledon, which became MK Dons. Um, you know, um, Chelsea have had financial issues. The fans kept turning up. I mean, historically, Chelsea had some of the highest average attendances in the Football League. Back in the early days, they were consistently at the top for capacity and crowd numbers. And so I don't think the sport struggles in London You could have your own professional league structure on its own. London could have its own professional league structure um, with all the clubs that play in Greater London. You could prop up your own football league in London alone. Um, as far as I'm aware, no London club is failing to attract fans. Some may have those down seasons where they're having a struggle or they're not playing as well. So some fans go, "Why should I bother paying my ticket to go?" But they will still be fans. Um, yeah, it would be great if Luton, but they've got to pay about 10 million in upgrades to get Kenilworth Road to Premier League standard for TV and the journalist side of things and the press box and all that kind of stuff with VAR. Um, but they're planning to move stadium anyway at some point. But it would be hilarious. I think hilarious to see Kenilworth Road Road in the Premier League with the away entrance facing through someone's living room. That would with basically flat over the top of it. That would be kind of interesting to see that. Um, one of the oldest. I mean, it's not. Look, the ground is looking tired. It is looking old. They are limited where they can't, expand in place because of the residential aspects of the surrounding area of Luton where the club is based. So they are looking at a potential new location just outside Luton for a new stadium. But it would be fantastic to see Kenilworth Road back in the top flight of English football for the first time. I think since the 80s, I believe, was the last time Luton were a top flight club. Um, I have to look at my club history video that I did, but that would be fantastic if that was to happen. Kenilworth, can you imagine as an away fan, and you go through that away entrance underneath, there's a part of a house. You have to go through someone's house basically, where the old terrace they sold the plot of land to Luton Football Club so they can have access, and that would be that'd be fun. Yeah, and I could imagine the new Everton Stadium in the Football League. That'd just be insane. But yes, Luton are looking at a potential new location for a new ground. That's been mentioned for the last couple of seasons that they're not going to be at Kenilworth Road much longer as a football club. But Luton have had a very, very good season. I look at their points total, and in any other season, that would be top of the Championship. It's just the fact that Burnley have been that good this season. And Sheffield United, to a certain extent, in another season, Sheffield United first and Luton are second in the automatic places. I mean, that is how cutthroat the Championship is. They've had a very, very good season. And I think going into the playoffs, they're one of the favourites to make the playoff final. But anything can happen in the playoffs, by the way. It is literally, 4 teams, 3 games, and it is the most lucrative match in world football, in club football. You get more money as the winner of the Championship playoff final than the Champions League final. So it's a very, very lucrative match for income. Imagine the Olympic Park in the Championship. That'd be crazy if West Ham go down. West Ham have spent a couple of seasons in what is now West Ham have either been in the top flight or the second tier. So they've never been down to what is now League One. They've always been a top 2 tier side. There are some clubs that have never been below the second level of English football. West Ham is one of them. So I can actually see that happening. It is potentially possible. Yeah, Luton Town, amongst a whole host of other clubs, have had financial issues, and their financial issues were partly because of the collapse of ITV Digital back in roughly 2002. They were one of the clubs that was impacted by the financial issues out of the collapse of ITV Digital, and they weren't alone. Out of the 72 Football League clubs, they were one of 14 that had financial issues in the following years. And there was a reason why I did that video. There was a reason why, looking back 20 odd years, the massive impacts that the collapse of ITV Digital had on the English game. And to a certain extent, Setanta had on the Scottish game and the English game. I mean, so that really shows, how when your media partners do end up having financial issues, especially when the lower leagues are so gate driven, so gate driven that it can have disastrous consequences. And Luton Town, following ITV Digital's collapse, have actually been in the non-league. So for Luton Town to get into the Premier League, which is possible, think of that. It wasn't that long ago they were a non-league club. They did spend a couple of seasons, I believe, in what is now the National League. They did fall out of the Football League for a while, not long after their financial issues. Um, they they really were facing extinction. It's fact. A lot of people forget about that. Um, and yeah, it was in our lifetimes that they were in the non-league, and that's crazy to a lot of people. Um, you've got this club on the verge of potentially making the Premier League. They haven't been in the top flight for over 30 odd years, but in that time frame since the 80s when they were last a top flight club until now, they've spent time in the non-league. It's been a rollercoaster ride if you're a Luton Town fan. And then people want to criticise their stadium for looking a bit tired and that. The club's almost gone out of business in the last 20 years and spent time outside the football leagues. Some of these people need to wake up and smell the roses and face the music that football club finances across the board are a mess. It doesn't matter. They've got some very wealthy backers of football clubs. It is a shambles how the game is run off the field financially. Um, yeah, look, John Gurney. A lot of the reason behind potentially merging with what was a Wimbledon Football Club and some of the decisions taken following the collapse of ITV Digital by owners was reactionary to the collapse of a media partner that cost a lot of money and a loss of income that was projected. So when Bury went out of business in League One, that had a knock-on effect for League One clubs back in 2019. The Accrington Stanley owner came out and said the fact that Bury had just gone out of business on the league games alone, the two league games alone, he said that cost us £250,000 in income. One club going out of business costs one other club £250,000 in income. Then you've got to multiply that by the other, 22 clubs in that division. Then you start seeing a loss, massive amounts of money. So the and that was before COVID. Think how much money COVID has wiped off the value of clubs and their income and their revenue streams. It's ridiculous, ridiculous, and it really has highlighted the issues that a lot of clubs are facing financially. Um, and now what we see with like clubs like Southend and Scunthorpe and Oldham and their struggles are in part because of COVID, and also in part by owners who A should never own the clubs, or B ownership models or decisions taken in the last 20 years that are reactionary to the collapse of ITV Digital and then the financial crisis that we had in 2007 to 2010. Um, so the current situation with football, you can trace some of the issues back to the late 90s, early 2000s, and even further back to the creation of the Premier League. There were issues following the creation of the Premier League in 1992 that had a squeeze on the lower league clubs in the 90s, and then they saw a glimmer of hope and light with the creation of ITV Digital that ultimately in 1998 that ultimately collapsed not that long after. And then the rebranding to the Championship from the old Division One structure, there were again hopes that things could look on the up, and it just did. Yeah. Look, John Gurney. Unless you're a Luton Town fan, you won't know a lot about him. And that's the thing. There are some bizarre owners in sport who come up with some bizarre ideas, really bizarre ideas that thankfully didn't take place. Because to build a 70,000 seater stadium in Luton is ridiculous. An F1 track. I mean, look. At the time he was coming up with the F1 track idea, the concern about Silverstone and Donington, there was Silverstone's contract in the 2000s was coming to an end with F1, and it was proposed, it was meant to take place that Donington would replace Silverstone, I think from 2008 2009 onwards, as the F1 track for the British Grand Prix. Now, the people who owned Donington did some dodgy dealings themselves, and obviously, thankfully, that changeover never happened. But I wouldn't rate current Silverstone layout as a good track for F1. Touring cars maybe, but F1 not so much. Then there was plans to build an F1 level circuit in Wales, which I believe is the one that Gurney was potentially involved in. That never materialised in the end. But there have been some bizarre decisions taken by sports owners, not just here in the UK, but in the US and Canada and Australia and all around the world. There's been some bizarre proposals put forward and some bizarre decisions taken by some what I would class as colourful characters is the best way. How Howard Ballard, Harold Ballard, Harold Ballard, for example, the former Maple Leafs owner in the NHL, is a very colourful owner. In his time in charge of the Toronto Maple Leafs, read up on the Harold Ballard story. They're doing a film about that. That's going to be hilarious. Um, there's been some other pretty colourful owners of some other North American major league teams. There's been some pretty colourful owners of some English football clubs. Some European football clubs have got some pretty interesting owners with some of their antics. I mean, the list is endless, um, and it does again, raise questions about who should be financing or investing in football clubs. There are some really, really bizarre things that team owners have done because they've got money. And in John Gurney's case, I mean, yeah, I wouldn't say the attempted name change to London Luton, the airport's called London Luton, but potential mergers happen in sport all the time where two teams merge together to continue representing the communities that they purport to represent, in order to save both clubs going out of existence. So club mergers have happened. Clubs exist because of club mergers. So that's not bizarre. It's happened in the past, but at the time he was doing it, I mean, Wimbledon had their own issues at the time. They didn't even have a stadium to play in. And they ended up obviously going to Milton Keynes in the end. And the story behind that created a lot of division. I mean, there was a lot of bizarre things happening in the late '90s, early 2000s. There was this influx of extra cash from Sky Sports. ITV Digital goes belly up. We just had the Super League war in rugby league in Australia, between the ARL and Rupert Murdoch, and Russell Packer, or the Packer family, another media family. Um, they were throwing money around like it was going out of fashion. The North American leagues were throwing money around like it was going out of fashion, and trying to boost their popularity not only to domestic audience in the US and Canada, but to a global audience with films like The Mighty Ducks and Space Jam and some of their marketing decisions. Um, you know, really, really, you know, yeah. I mean, Craig Breen. He wasn't even a full-time World Rally Championship driver. He only did certain events. Yeah, it just highlights how dangerous motorsport is, especially rallying. Um, with all the new, safety features motorsports brought in, with the FIA roll cages and the crash structures of rally cars, and just you know motor vehicles in general, and the safety features that have been brought in over a significant period of time. That is very, very sad news. But it does highlight how dangerous, especially rallying is. Um, it's that risk factor that draws fans to the motorsport. It's the risk factor that draws fans to like the Isle of Man TT and to motocross, supercross, the superbikes, MotoGP. I mean, thankfully, fatalities now in motorsport are a hell of a lot less than what they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. Motorsport safety has come so far in my lifetime. It's motorsport now is unrecognisable from what it was all those years ago, and for good reason. However, fatalities like this do still unfortunately occur, and when they do occur, they're more shocking now than what they were 30, 40 years ago. The previous generation, if you ask like your parents, your grandparents about F1, Grand Prix motorcycle racing, rallying, touring cars, you know, IndyCar, NASCAR. You ask like older relatives and older friends what motorsport was like in, let's say, the mid from 2000 and before, because Dale Earnhardt's death brought in the hands device, for example, and the safer barriers and the runoff areas and all that. You ask what it was like before, right? Before Senna and before Dale Earnhardt's deaths. before 2000, you ask what it was like. It was a regular basis, so you didn't get shocked anymore when a high profile or even a low profile driver was killed. The reports would go, "Yeah, okay, the TT this year we had 6 fatalities." The commentators go, "Oh," and so now when we have a fatality in motorsport or a severe injury in motorsport, it sends shockwaves through the sport and through the fandom and through the general public. Those are that's shocking. But the generation before, so our parents' generation, for example, or those who were hardcore fans in the 80s, it was an everyday occurrence. Every event you would expect severe injury or death. It became so regular that when possibly the greatest driver of all time in many people's eyes, in Ayrton Senna, died, that F1 brought in a lot of changes. And then when Dale Earnhardt, again, possibly in many people's eyes, the greatest NASCAR driver of all time up to that point died, the two massive figures in motorsport die within 5 6 years of each other. Suddenly, the world goes, actually, we need to make motorsport far safer than what it is. And it took for like the two of the greatest drivers in their categories to die in similar circumstances with the injuries that they sustained for drastic changes in safety to occur. We've only seen one fatality in F1 since, and that was due to injuries sustained late down the line with Jules Bianchi. We've only seen a couple of fatalities, I think, in GP2. Again, um, in how long? IndyCar is possibly the most dangerous track form of motorsport that we currently have out in cars. Motorcycles, unfortunately, you know, death and serious injury continually occur. They have made it a lot safer than what it was. Um, However, motorcycle racing, you are never going to stop that risk factor. The TT last year claimed more lives. I think 5 people died at the TT or something. It was one of the highest death tolls they have seen in decades at the TT last year. So the risk factor is still there, which then draws competitors to the sport and fans. But it, you're never going to get rid of the fact that we've been so blessed by having so few fatalities in motorsport in comparison to previous generations and previous decades is a testament to the safety features that we have now and the runoff areas and the medical facilities and changes made to track design, to vehicle design, to the helmets, to the flammable suits, to the motorcycle leathers now have airbags in them. Instant kill switches. A whole number of things have made motorsport a hell of a lot safer. So yes, it's why it's more shocking that he's died, and the fact his co-driver escaped uninjured is terrifying. That just shows where the impact was, and that gives you an idea of what side of the vehicle the impact was on the driver's side. But yeah, look, I mean, obviously, I remember when Colin McRae won the world championship in '95. The mid '90s, British sport was, I believe, on a high. The mid '90s for British sport was fantastic. The mid '90s to the early 2000s, British sport, we just produced a lot of high quality sportsmen and women in this country, and we're starting a generation later to produce them again. So we have these generational talents that pop along, and every 20, 25 years or so, we suddenly have these generational talents. And Richard Burns was a generational talent, and now we're seeing it again all these years later. Now we're having another batch of generational talents coming through that were inspired by the previous generational talents. It's not very often that you get every year just continual talent coming through. Sometimes you just get that clutch of an age group or a talent pool all at one time in a very brief period, just fantastic. And then the others are pretty good, but then you just have that spike where every so often you just go, whoop, generational talents or really talented group, still very talented, whoop, another spike. And every 15 to 25 years, you suddenly get these generational talent. Richard Burns was a very, very talented racing car driver in rallying. Same with Colin McRae. Obviously, we had Carl Fogarty in the superbikes, who made superbikes, interesting to a global audience. Jonathan Ray in recent years. Again, that 20 to generational gap between the two. It's fantastic that they come along. Um, you know, and I remember, Richard Bird. He was brought up. He was a local to the area that I live in. He's from Reading, which is just down the road from where I live now. And again, that um, was an interesting subplot. He was local to where I live, which is another thing. Um, but it's sad that he obviously passed away young through cancer. That's obviously a massive shame, because I think had he not had his illness, I think he would still have been very, very competitive in the World Rally Championship for at least another decade after that. But it happens that, unfortunately, um, you know health sometimes cuts careers short and cuts life short. I think, cancer research, he should have been the poster boy for cancer research, really, because at that time he was a national and global icon. People knew who weren't even rally fans knew who Richard Burns was. He was the way World Rally Championship marketed itself back in the day was fantastic. Now I think the World Rally Championship has missed a trick with the TV rights and how they market themselves. And at a time when sports, sports marketing and growing sports is so cutthroat and competitive. You get that right marketing tool, you can really sell your sport to a much wider audience. And that's where I think certain sports or certain sports leagues have missed a trick. And yes, I think the Premier League is just the marketing machine of the Premier League has been fantastic. Something else that I should have mentioned is the Premier League clubs have voted after the 2025-2026 season to ban betting sponsorship on their jerseys. Now, that doesn't mean the naming rights for stadiums won't necessarily have betting sponsorship, but I think we're now starting to see a trend here. Um, there's been a growing call to restrict or reduce gambling advertising in professional sport, not just football, for some time. The sports that will be exempt will be horse racing and greyhound racing. Um, but yeah, there is a growing trend and a growing push from politicians, pressure groups, and just people in society saying, actually, we're not so keen on having gambling sponsorship. And it's going back in time to the 90s when the tobacco companies said, "Oh, your sports will be bankrupt without us," and sport has survived without tobacco sponsorship. We do see in certain jurisdictions where alcohol sponsorship is banned in the Western world, such as in France. So we're seeing this pushback here in the UK. It's very interesting, though, that in North America, especially in the major leagues like the NHL and the NBA, they're actually going the other way. They're increasing their betting sponsorship in recent years with the liberalisation and the relaxation of gambling laws in the US in recent years. So, whereas in Europe we're starting to go one way, the North American sports market is going the other. Same with Australia. I have noticed the rising betting. So when I watch the NRL live feeds on the NRL website, which is the Fox feed, by the way, in Australia, I'm noticing a rise in gambling ads and gambling sponsorship of teams. I think almost every team now has a gambling partner as a company that provides sponsorship to clubs, sometimes on jerseys, and it's very, very obvious where they're putting the their logo, their company name on said jersey. It's very, very noticeable, and so we've seen this pushback here in the UK. I don't know why the French decided to ban alcohol sponsorship on jerseys and in professional sport. It's been a rule for a very, very long time in France, very, very long time. I'll have to look at the alcohol sponsorship ban in France and when they introduced that. That'll be very, very interesting. But they banned alcohol sponsorship in France for well over 2 decades. I think nearly 30 years. I think that's been a long-standing law in France. But it's very interesting that we're now seeing this pushback. Now it'll be very interesting to see if the Football League follows suit. And what is very interesting is up in Scotland, the Scottish Football League has decided not to go down the same route. Now, Scottish football finances are significantly different to the English game. A lot of clubs barely make even. And so it'd be very, very interesting to see eventually what the the Scottish FA and the Scottish Professional Football League have basically said it's a club decision, it's club to club decision. It's up to the clubs to agree sponsorship deals with sponsors. Um, and there's now growing pressure on football and other professional sports to also wean themselves off alcohol sponsorship as well. Although I have noticed alcohol sponsorship is a lot less than what it was 20 years ago. Um, we are trending towards other forms of other companies now sponsoring um, uh, sports teams and leagues. The recent trend, I would say, in the last 20 years is towards the gambling firms, especially the online gambling firms as well. And that's following the ban on tobacco sponsorship. So that is an unintended consequence, I believe, of the ban on gambling sponsors. And I'm sorry, on sorry, tobacco sponsors, and the uptick is gambling money has come in as in response to the end of when they brought the ban in for tobacco sponsorship. I do believe the tobacco sponsors, depending on the agreements and the contracts in place, were allowed to finish their agreements with said teams and leagues and events, but they weren't allowed to renew. So that was very, very interesting. Was that if I think some teams and leagues and sports signed agreements not long before the ban on tobacco sponsorship in sport came into place. And what is very interesting, F1 was very noticeable. Most of the F1 teams are based in the UK. Now, Ferrari, obviously being one that's based outside of the UK, kept the Marlboro sponsorship for that little bit longer. But for the most part, tobacco sponsorship disappeared very, very quickly. And then it was just like the Marlboro and the West logos, for example, slowly faded out. But the actual brand names were no longer on cars. Like BAR Honda used to have Lucky Strike, for example. Ferrari used to have Marlboro. I think Benetton at one point had Camel as one of, and Jordan had Camel, which is another tobacco brand, and McLaren had West, which is a German tobacco brand. They all slowly disappeared, slowly. We still have alcohol sponsorship in motorsport, not on the same level as what we did before. And it's very, very noticeable that trend away and the rise of the gambling sponsors in sport. But we'll see what happens, and we'll see what industries and companies fill that void if gambling sponsorship of sport gets banned. Yes, the World Snooker Championship did start yesterday. I've really tuned off snooker in recent years, and a lot of it is to do with the match fixing scandals and how the sport is dealing with corruption and match fixing. I don't think they're doing a very good job. We're seeing a massive rise in allegations of corruption within the sport. And again, this is another sport that's heavily reliant on gambling sponsors. Yeah, Jordan also, they've originally had Camel, then they had B&H, they had Benson Hedges, yes. Williams at one point had Rothmans. So there's some very famous tobacco brands that were plastered all over F1 liveries, especially in the 90s. It was very, very noticeable that the tobacco sponsors that signed up with Formula One teams at the time. And I think F1 were allowed to keep tobacco sponsorship in a reduced form for a little bit longer. It was the Labour government under Tony Blair that really brought in the legislation to move away from tobacco sponsorship, which then a lot of the EU nations signed up to, and then it just didn't become a thing anymore. But yeah, France, I think, is the only European country to ban alcohol advertising in regards to sport. I think they ban alcohol advertising on TV as well and on radio. So France is very, very strict on its alcohol advertising. I think that alcohol advertising ban was brought in a very similar time to the tobacco ban as well. I think the French government at the time brought in, I think it was under Jacques Chirac or Mitterrand, brought in legislation, sort of similar to the tobacco legislation with sport, on top, which was linked in. Um, so when like clubs like Liverpool, who used to have obviously Carlsberg as a sponsor, played in Europe, let's say in France, they weren't allowed to have their Carlsberg. They had to have an alternate third jersey set aside when they played against French clubs in Europe. It was very, very noticeable. Um, and I'm trying to think of some other clubs. I think Celtic and Rangers, for example, and I think some other Scottish clubs at various points have had alcohol sponsorship. Um, there have been some other English clubs as well that have had alcohol sponsors over the years. But I remember the Liverpool Carlsberg one was a long-standing. Newcastle with Newcastle Brown in the 90s. So when these clubs, McEwen's Lager with Blackburn, so when these clubs were playing in France, for example, in pre-season friendlies or in European games, they had to wear alternate jerseys or jerseys without any sponsors or logos on them, which was very, very striking. And thinking, what's going on? Oh, it's France. Um, and that's very, very interesting, considering how important the beer and wine industries are to the French economy. That's a very interesting one. I think they ban advertising, but it is what it is. And until recently, obviously, the US with gambling outside of Nevada and Atlantic City and those jurisdictions that allowed casinos, and outside of the state of Nevada, gambling advertising was strictly regulated and prohibited in some states. And now it's allowed on the networks, and it's become part of the broadcast now. Where same with Australia, where it's become part of the broadcast, and it's almost insidious how other jurisdictions have got the gambling as part of the broadcast now, and the odds, and it's very noticeable, especially when you follow the overseas leagues as much as I do with the NRL and the AFL, for example, and the NHL. It's very, very noticeable in recent years. Same in Australia, with the growth of the gambling, sports gambling advertising, and linking it in with sport programs sponsored by a betting firm or a gambling company or a casino. Very, very noticeable. In the US, it's become more noticeable since Vegas joined the league, with MGM Resorts becoming a major sponsor of several teams and of the league itself. But MGM Resorts also do have non-gambling based recreational activities. Very, very, very noticeable there. Crown Casino Group in Australia. Now, they've been involved in some scandals away from sport, but that's very noticeable as well, with Crown Casino in Australia and Crown Resorts, very similar to MGM with their involvement. They were major sponsors for a while of the Melbourne Storm. Um, so it was very, very noticeable with certain sports leagues and certain jurisdictions with gambling advertising. So yeah, that's another one. So we'll see what happens if the UK leads the way, and if, for example, the Premier League, which is possibly the biggest global league in the world, um, for global reach and interests in multiple markets. We can argue the NFL or the NBA with its profits, but if that, with the international reach of the English Premier League and English football, for example, especially with the US, if gambling advertising gets banned, it's going to be very, very interesting to see what the reaction in the US, in Canada, in Australia is going to be if when that move away from gambling advertising, if it actually becomes a permanent ban by legislation, that's going to be interesting. But a lot of people have criticised the Scottish Professional Football League for their stance, saying it's down to the individual clubs to decide who comes in as a shirt sponsor or a partner for the club. And what is very, very noticeable is the financial difference. Very, very noticeable. It's very striking, um, and very, very noticeable. The fact that they are getting heavily criticised um, for that statement saying we're not going to follow suit. I'm also interested in the fact they've waited until the end of the 2025-26 season to bring in this move away. And obviously the Premier League clubs have looked at their sponsorship deals, and I think the last gambling sponsorship deal actually run for a shirt sponsor runs out that year, I believe. So it gives a lot of clubs a lot of time to go, right, we need to get new sponsors in. Let's have a look at engineering firms, car firms, banking, various other industries to say, look, come in and be our shirt sponsor, be our stadium sponsor. It does give clubs a fair bit of leeway to go, right, 2026, the start of that 26-27 season, we need to get, a new sponsor in. I think that could be another reason behind it. So let's have a look at the current football scores in the Premier League. Obviously, promotion to the Premier League, relegation. There's a lot riding on a lot of the games today and this weekend. Let's have a look at what the latest scores are. West Ham 2, Arsenal 2. Arsenal really do need to win that game to maintain their lead at the top. Man City are hunting them down. Nottingham Forest play Manchester United. Their kickoffs in 45 minutes. That's crucial for both clubs. Man United's form has been a bit wobbly in recent weeks, and Nottingham Forest trying to get out the bottom three. Very, very interesting. Man United, if they win that game, they leapfrog Newcastle. If they lose that game, goal difference is going to be key there. Their goal difference isn't great. They are 3 points above Spurs, but their goal difference could count against them in the race for Europe. The bottom end, Forest, their goal difference is not great either. A defeat doesn't help them in their battle to avoid the drop. Although Everton, we don't know if they're going to get hit with a points deduction. I think Southampton are done. I think Leicester are done. I think that last relegation spot between Everton and Forest, and a lot does hinge on what happens to Everton and penalties that they receive. I think Chelsea, Palace could leapfrog them. There's some clubs with some shocking defensive records here as well. And the top club out, but Arsenal, they do honestly need to get a result. And Saka's missed a penalty, so there's that. And let's have a look at the Wilson Johnston have sacked their manager. Mbappe's now become the PSG's all-time top scorer in League One at French football. Obviously. Oh, right. Okay. So Forest Green Rovers have been relegated from League One. That is now confirmed as of yesterday. They got battered 5-1 by Barnsley. They are the first side in the English Football League to suffer relegation. They've only won 6 matches all season. And of course, Duncan Ferguson was appointed in January. They were already very tailed off. That is not great. That's not a stat you want. And the fact that, oh my God, the points gap between Forest Green Rovers and the rest of the league is absolutely shocking. They were 12 points behind Accrington and Morecambe. And their goal difference of -51 is just dreadful. Forest Green Rovers, could they do a Yeovil Town and just disappear from the Football League very, very quickly? Although Accrington and Morecambe aren't doing too well either, neither are Cambridge United, which is very, very interesting. But no one's officially come out of League One yet. Plymouth, Ipswich and Sheffield Wednesday, 2 points separate the top 3. And Sheffield Wednesday played a game more than Ipswich Plymouth. That's very interesting. So that's an interesting one. Obviously, the ongoing situation with Sadio Mane at Bayern Munich, and we discussed that earlier with the Tuchel appointment at Munich. Now it's not working as effectively as hoped. To me, Bayern Munich have been papering over the cracks for a couple of years in German football, and I think other clubs have just massively closed that gap. And some, again, we talk about transfers and when players move from one club to another and how it doesn't always work, how certain signings don't always work. Sadio Mane at Bayern, is it working? He's been missed by Liverpool, and yes, Bayern are still battling for the Bundesliga title, but not all harmony there. And they've replaced manager this season, and Tuchel is that the solution to Bayern's problems? We should wait and see what happens, long term. And Nagelsmann didn't last that long in the job, so that tells you that Bayern, there's things going on at Bayern that are becoming problematic. So we'll see what happens there. And I think the gap in German football's closed, and it's become very competitive all of a sudden. Then we look at, as I say, circling back to other teams and clubs. Over here in English football, it's very striking how certain clubs, the win now mentality every season, actually in the long run does more damage than having a couple of down seasons to refresh, understand truly what's going on with player development, youth development, bringing in the right players to fill certain positions rather than just getting any big name that's out there. And the constant changing of managers, I do honestly think that the shelf life of a manager now is too short. I think the win now mentality, or win at all costs mentality is counterproductive. In the short term, it may do you very well to have that shock factor, like at Chelsea in the past, where like Tuchel comes in mid-season, Di Canio comes in mid-season, and they inherit a squad of players that the previous manager put together and win with them, and then the following season or the season after that, they're gone. I think Chelsea's ownership style had run its course, and I think now we're seeing where Chelsea truly do belong, which is mid-table at best. And that may be they might hold mid-table going forward unless they get the right guy in and they actually sort out their transfer policy, because their transfer policy and some of the contracts some of the players are on are disastrous for the club. And if the government does come in with their white paper with an independent regulator, and when UEFA do bring in their new financial rules, clubs like Chelsea with their current model of constantly churning over the manager and constant spending big, it's going to be over. And that's going to have a massive impact on the game, and we could see huge momentous swings in the powers that be within club football. Huge momentous swings. But yeah, the West Ham Arsenal game was 2-2. Arsenal really need to win that game, because I think Man City, the momentum swinging slightly towards them with Manchester City. So that is very, very interesting that it's 2-2. Let's have a look. It's still 2-2. And Arsenal were 2-0 up. They were 2-0 up after just 10 minutes. West Ham have scored 2 goals either side of half time. There is a missed penalty in the game, which has proved, I think, crucial. And it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. As things currently stand, they've got 4 points gap over Man City. But Man City and Newcastle, to that extent, have games in hand. No, Newcastle ain't going to close the gap on Man City. Man United have a game in hand over Newcastle, but a worse goal difference and a worse. And Spurs, I think, they may be lucky to finish fifth. Have you looked into the government one? I haven't read it in full. I know that the white paper isn't doesn't cover every recommendation that the independent fan body wanted. In order to read the full white paper, that's going to be a very, very long time. Now, there's going to be changes to that legislation. We do know that, to the independent regulator. Because basically, how it happens when legislation is brought forward, you'll have several readings, and it will go back and then be amended and then go back. I think you're allowed, 3 readings in the Commons and then 3 readings in the Lords before it goes to the final vote, a maximum of. You don't have to hit those 3 readings of Commons and Lords. That's the maximum you can go to before a final vote. And then once it's gone through that process of amendments, because every time a white paper is brought forward, be it by government benches or a backbencher, bring, because you can be a member of parliament and not sit in the cabinet or the shadow cabinet, and you can propose, because the shadow cabinet can also propose counter legislation to or amendments or to current legislation. When brand new legislation, however, comes along, it has to be from the government benches or a backbencher. If it's an amendment to existing legislation, that can also come from the shadow cabinet, ironically. Very rarely. This is how anal I am about this, because I did study politics and law at sixth form college. Um, so there's a maximum of 3 readings per house. It can be done on first reading. They may go, we don't need any amendments. We'll send it to the Lords. The House of Lords will go, we don't need any amendments. Give it back, and then it goes to a final vote. Whether that then passes or gets rejected is down to the members of the Commons to decide. Um, I would argue, as it's still in the white paper phase and going through multiple readings, um, before it will probably get discussed before summer recess. They've got a couple of months before Parliament shuts down for the summer, and of course we've got the local elections next month. In I think 1/3 of councils, I believe, or every council, I think 1/3 of seats in councils are up for in England, and Wales are up for, and Scotland, I believe, are up for council elections. So there's a lot going on there. Um, so we've got, I would say, about 18 months left of this current government before we have a general election. Maybe May next year at the earliest. If the current government wants to get this legislation through, they're going to need to speed up the process from proposing a white paper to getting through all the readings and sessions. I would reckon end of May, beginning of June at the earliest, potentially beginning of September when this goes to the final vote. If that is the case, I can see several amendments being made. I haven't read through the initial text. I think it differs somewhat from the independent panel that was set up to review football regulation. I think there are some changes from the proposal that fans groups put forward initially. I think they had a 50-point, 40-point plan or something. I believe the legislation or proposal as it currently stands differs from that in some areas. I think there's been some compromises given, and we do know that a proportion of Premier League clubs are resisting and are not happy with it. But the majority of clubs in the Football League and Premier League, I think, are in favour. I think it's the big six that are the ones really resisting. Maybe half the Premier League are, digging their heels in. I believe there's been a consultation process in the media and sports select committee as well, with industry leaders in professional football and especially fan groups and people from within the game in more administrative roles have been questioned. I think club owners have been basically bollocked. Basically, members of the EFL and Premier League as well have been dragged in. Members of the FA have been dragged in with the media, culture, and sports select committee. That then gets fed back, and I mean, this has been an ongoing concern since during COVID, basically. COVID highlighted a lot of the issues that we had. I think the European Super League was accelerated. That idea was accelerated by COVID. I think that the pandemic has highlighted massive disparities in how TV revenue and sponsorship is divvied up and what deals are worth for sponsorship. And I think the COVID pandemic exposed football clubs for how they're not being overly transparent in their finances, because I think it was the 2015-2016 season. The Premier League clubs that season basically admitted, this is what they claimed, they could let us in for like £10 or less, which was striking. And then we the question comes up, Fulham are now charging about £3,000 for a season ticket. So I know COVID's obviously happened in that time frame. Of course, we've got the current rate of inflation, cost of living crisis, but something doesn't add up if the 20 wealthiest clubs or the 20 top clubs in the country at the time for that one-off season are saying, now we can let the fans in for next to nothing. To then 3-4 years later going, we need government bailouts, we've got to furlough staff, all this and that during the lockdowns and the COVID pandemic. It does raise some questions about how truthful football clubs were about their finances, how transparent clubs were with their finances and the owners as well. And it also begs the question: where's all the TV money gone? Where's all the income gone? Because the amount of money the Premier League actually makes is ridiculous, and the amount of money the Premier League actually spends on transfers, wages, and compensation for managers who get sacked is ridiculous as well. So there is a large amount of questions about the incomes and outgoings, of clubs and the finances and the transparency of the system. Um, I think there's going to be very strict rules on player agents. I think there's going to be very, very strict rules on salary expenditure. I think it's going to be um, not just covering the Premier League, but the Football League and I think every level of the English game. I don't know if it applies to the Scottish game. I will say that. I don't know if this independent regulator is going to cover Scotland. I think that could be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. I haven't read that in it. I think a lot of it comes from English football fans demanding action be taken on how clubs are run. I don't think the Scottish game can afford um, not to follow suit. Um, but we've not heard anything from the Scottish government itself on the issue. I wouldn't be surprised if whoever wins at Holyrood in the next devolved election in Scotland would not be surprised if the devolved government uh, is pressured into bringing forward similar legislation for the Scottish game. Would not be surprised at all, especially with the precarious case of Scottish club finances in the game in Scotland. We've now seen the Premier League clubs realising that the damaging PR that we've just had with the European Super League and some of the actions of some of our clubs, we might want to, so the gambling sponsorship. And they've seen they follow social media. They follow what I think the clubs realise now that fans are a big part of the game. This is why I'm so surprised with Fulham upping their season ticket costs to £3,000. Admittedly, it's only for one stand, but that's quite interesting. It's the first time they've had back-to-back seasons in the Premier League for a very, very long time. So for next season, they're going to be a Premier League club as well. Under the current ownership, that hasn't happened before since Mohamed Al Fayed sold up to the Khan family, Sahid and Tony. That's very, very interesting as well. And so it links back in. And good result for West Ham, Arsenal. I wouldn't say, look, Arsenal got 4 points. They've got that buffer. Yes, it's not a desired result, but there's still, if Arsenal win every other game, they're done. Man City have also proven that they're not the team they were 2-3 seasons ago. And no team has lost the Premier League from Arsenal's position that they were at January 1st. I think the pressure's got to them a little bit, but Blackburn in '95 with the same. It went down. Man City's first title. It went down to the final day. Yes, records can be broken, but I don't think it's ever happened in Football League history that a team has been that far ahead and lost. I think they do it. I think it's going to be closer than what fans anticipated on the 1st of January, but Man City are starting to look a little bit more human. They are competing on multiple fronts. They've got an FA Cup semi-final next weekend. They're still in the Champions League. And yeah, Haaland's scoring Haaland's scoring stats are ridiculous, but when De Bruyne is not playing well, Haaland doesn't score. That's very noticeable. When De Bruyne is having an off day or isn't playing, Haaland's goal scoring stats drop off. He still does score goals, obviously, but his goals per game ratio, the goals per shots on target, is significantly less without De Bruyne on form or in the team than when he's in the team. So, if you can shut down De Bruyne, you shut down Haaland. It's very noticeable that his goals per game ratio in Haaland, with assists or playing well or not playing when he is playing well. But Man City, I think, there's been a lot made about Haaland's scoring record. And his development and how he was passed over by other managers saying we don't want this guy in our team, whatever reason, when he was younger, when he was, I believe, at Schalke or in Norway. Was he at Schalke? No, he was in Norwegian football, I believe, and then he ends up at Dortmund. A lot of people passed on Haaland when he was younger as well, which is very, very noticeable. Do I think it's declined? I think the quality of football has declined from what it was in the 90s when I really got into football as a kid. I think the quality of football we're watching now is of a lesser quality than between the mid '90s and the mid 2000s. I really do. I think while goal scoring's gone up, I look at the historical trends and look at goal scoring records of the 20s to the 50s in look at my club history videos. Some of the goals per season. Some players are putting up Haaland numbers in the 30s on mud bath. So what Haaland's done this season, I think, shows that. I do think the quality of football was at its peak in the '90s and the 2000s. I wouldn't say Barcelona in that period was the best. I think that's when football started to go downhill in quality. Um, I honestly think right now the quality is dropping a little bit. Now maybe we've reached market saturation. I think the players now are far too pampered. I think the game has changed. The game has changed. I mean, I look back at some of the highlights reels and some of the interviews on podcasts. When you get ex-players on podcasts who were playing in the '90s and possibly the early 2000s, some of the things they were discussing about the dressing room, nights out, some of the challenges, the teams they played on. The game has evolved. Maybe not the culture within dressing rooms has, but the game that is played on the field, the style of play, the pace of the game, it has evolved. It's changed. Lower league clubs now have billiard table quality pitches that are like carpets to play on, whereas before they were mud baths. So even in the lower levels, infrastructure, stadium infrastructure has changed. The playing surface has changed. The investment in better playing surfaces. You don't have those horrible bobbly pitches anymore, really, in the lower leagues. You might have the occasional pitch that doesn't, not. I think the players are spoiled with the facilities they play on and train on now. And the diving in the sport's ridiculous. Defenders now are scared to make challenges, in my opinion. So yeah, but the sport I grew up watching as a kid and as a teenager is, I think, for me, the best we've ever seen. Now, I wouldn't say the man. I mean, yeah, the record-breaking Man City and Liverpool sides who've got over 100 plus points in the Premier League. Yeah, you could argue, okay, but to me, the Arsenal Invincibles and the treble-winning '99 team of Man United were possibly the two best teams ever to take the field in the Premier League on paper. On a one-off game, I mean, there's a reason why that rivalry in the late '90s, early 2000s between Arsenal and Manchester United was so fantastic. Then Abramovich comes along and modern football completely changes. But that Arsenal Invincibles under Wenger and the '99 treble-winning team under Ferguson were the two best teams I've ever seen take a field. But that's not just domestic football here in England. That is in Europe. They are the two best teams I think I've ever seen take to a football field. And yeah, there were some foreign players in there, and there were some domestic players in there. The level that they played at for a good, I'm going to say 5 to 10 year period. That period when Arsenal and Man United were the top of English football. There were other clubs winning trophies as well. Other clubs that have world class players who were finishing like 10th in the Premier League. Yeah, doesn't happen. It's starting to happen again. I think we're going to see a downward dip and an upward trend when the Ballon d'Or becomes more competitive for players rather than the Messi Ronaldo farce that's been for the best part of 15 years, where it's just been a wank off between their fans, basically. It really is. It's a dick measuring competition between Ronaldo fans and Messi fans. And in reality, while they are brilliant goal scorers and the goals per game ratio is ridiculous, what they got in club football, in reality, the football around them has been shit. If they were playing 20 years earlier, they don't put up those stats. That's my argument. They don't put up the stats because the game has changed where they are protected, where they're not fouled as much. Can you imagine Messi and Ronaldo playing in the '90s? They're hacked off the field. Their careers are shorter. Their knees, ankles, and legs are broken all the time. They would not have had the longevity they've had into their late 30s had they played 10, 20 years earlier. They would have been kicked out the top flight of European football. They would have had to have kicked back and been dirty players to survive. That's the difference. And they wouldn't have been able to get away with that diving because a player would have had enough snapped his leg. Ronaldo, especially, his leg would have been snapped in half by a Thomas Repka type defender. Well, I'll have enough of you. You're an arrogant prick. Bang! Oh, your knee's out. Shame. You don't get the Roy Keanes who did what he did to Alvin Haaland anymore. You just don't have those players because it's not allowed. Gattuso, I think, and Mascherano were the last two really gnarly midfielders that I can seem to remember who generally hurt players. You don't get those halfmen anymore. So if you were a talented player, you had to play dirty at times to survive. And Messi and Ronaldo, they especially Ronaldo with his petulance and his rolling around and his diving, he wouldn't have survived in the 90s and the early 2000s. He didn't really settle in until the later 2000s as a player. He really actually honestly struggled in his earlier years. He did score some highlight reel goals, but he didn't. He took longer to develop than Messi. Partly because the style of the English game was so brutal, but the game as a whole, Messi had a lot of really hard nosed, especially in the international and those players to defend him. And there were some pretty gnarly midfielders at Barcelona who didn't mind leaving the studs in on a player and defenders as well when he first started playing. As his career went on, those players disappeared from the game. The game has evolved to a point where you lose the hard men, which is the character guys, as I call them, those box to box midfielders that just tackle all day long, and those centre backs that intimidate players. You don't get them anymore. That's another reason why I like watching football in the 90s and the early 2000s was you had those really tough bastards who you wouldn't want to meet on a Friday night outside a pub in Stoke because you're going to get your head. You don't have the Duncan Ferguson centre forwards anymore who didn't mind breaking a guy's jaw in a match out of prison. You don't have those characters, which is why Messi and Ronaldo, you know, had the stats they've had. If they play in the 90s, they don't get those stats. Partly because they're having a lot more time on the field, off the field, injured and suspended because they've got to fight for that space around the goal. They've got to fight to get on the ball more. And they've got to play dirty in order to win the respect and actually win the space. That's why I have a lot more time for players like Figo, who grace the midfield, both Real Madrid and Barcelona, because he could tackle it, push goals. Those distribution box to box midfielders who were skilled but could distribute. Scholes couldn't tackle, mind. He had a few red cards because his tackle technique was dreadful, but he would lead. Your Roy Keane. You don't have that anymore in professional football. That has been the game has evolved where it's all about the skill now. It's all about the skill. The way the players dive and play act to get other players sent off. You are that gnarly bot. You've got to be a Claude Makalele and Kante are basically the only players you can tackle in the modern game. Other players have to mould themselves in a Claude Makalele type who rarely got sent off, rarely got booked, could time his tackle. And it was all about positioning. The game has evolved. And I think, and not necessarily in the best way. We might still these highlight reel goals, but you actually miss the proper derby matches where the players don't like each other and the tackles actually hurt. And I think that's why I actually enjoy watching women's football is they leave studs in. They actually do hurt each other. They tackle like men used to tackle 20, 25 years ago and you don't get the diving because it's not tolerated in the women's game. Remember when they threw pigs? Yes. Another funny thing, the ultras also threw their mobile phones with their SIM cards in at Figo's head, which I thought, well, that's a great way for the Guardia Civil to arrest you because you've just given them all your details via a phone number. So how they managed to smuggle a pig's head in is beyond me, but I think it's because he'd signed for the rival club and the hatred's that bad that the security were like, okay, get it. But that was a big thing. You don't go from Barcelona to Real Madrid. And I think the home security allowed them to get a pig's head into the stadium precisely because he'd gone to the rival club and, let's inflame tensions a bit more because it's El Clasico, the most overrated derby in the world. Seriously, Spanish football is so overrated. It's depressing. It's depressing. Spanish football right now is so overrated as a league. It's almost laughable. And those two clubs have regularly flouted the financial spending rules for 20 years. It's embarrassing for the game. Embarrassing for the game. They poach the best South American and European talent, and now we hear about the allegations of match fixing and bribery. It's not good. Oh well, you say that, but their debts would say that they're one of the worst run clubs in the world at the same time off the field. And while they are a global brand that attracts players, and we can all agree that, that some of the best English players have also played there, the club culture is not a particularly nice one. And the way the club's been run and the club president, they leave a bit of taste in the mouth for everyone because while they are, you know, a global brand, the way they've been run and also their club president and a proportion of their fan base are pretty vile as well. Leave a very bitter taste in the mouth for fans of the sport. I don't care what club you support. You could be a La Liga fan, but the way Real Madrid act off the field, with how they pursue young players, their financial dealings, their club president, and their fan base, they're not a particularly nice club. They're a very toxic club, and a lot of players have gone there and gone, "Nah, this is." And while they are super skilled players, gone there and it's like, "Nah, this is not for me." Not because the league they play in is bad. The league is actually very entertaining, but it's the club culture and it's how the club is run and the atmosphere. Some superstar players have gone there and done nothing. The Galacticos era. They go to other clubs and they're back being successful again, or they're enjoying what they do. Whereas at Real Madrid, it's I don't enjoy what I'm doing. Why am I here? Oh, my agent's got me a good deal, but I'm not playing, or the culture is wrong. Yeah, and yeah, and I think Real Madrid, while they are one of the most successful clubs of all time, I don't necessarily think they've been good for football in Spain, Europe, or globally. Ironically, I think they've actually done a lot of reputational damage to the game with what happens off the field. And I honestly think they're not the only club. I don't like how Barcelona have behaved as well in the last 15, 20 years, as we've now found out. They've gone down a similar path as well um, because they saw what Real Madrid were doing in regards to winning all these Champions Leagues and breaking all these European records. They followed suit, and they've obviously got a great history in Europe now, it's more the operational side. Sod what the fans do. It's the operational side about how they poach players, breach youth transfer policy, deliberately undercut, other clubs. Um, it yeah, their culture. This is why I love Bilbao. I do. I do love Bilbao and how much longer they can continue with their modified Cantara policy. They've actually had to modify it. So if you play for another Basque club at some point, you can suddenly doesn't matter if you're still playing that, you can suddenly be signed. I think slowly but surely the club hierarchy and the fans realise that while they preserve their Basque identity for as long as they have, in order to get, well, in order not only to remain at the top of the Spanish game, but also get successful again and win trophies for the first time in about a decade, 2 decades, they're going to have to evolve that policy and maybe evolve it to a point where, okay, we can't continue with this Cantara policy anymore. It is just not sustainable at the same level as what it was 20, 30 years ago. And that's one of the things I kind of miss about clubs before is more local players played for a club. It really was, even Real Madrid and Barcelona, a lot more local players would play for them than they do now. So I think that's. But I like Athletic Bilbao. I will do a club history on them. They are a very successful club. They're one of only three clubs never to be relegated from the Liga. They regularly compete for the European places. They don't always get into Europe. They've been a bit on a downward spell for the last decade or so, but some of the talent they've unearthed, who've gone on to play for Spain, it's fantastic. Um, but I will say this: I think their Cantara policy has got a limited shelf life now. They've had to evolve it, and I think it will eventually. They'll have to go. Do we want to win silverware or just be a mid-table La Liga club, or do we actually want to win silverware again? And I think they're going to go. The game has evolved over the last 30 years, where we can't just rely on local talent anymore. We have to rely on global talent in order to survive. The reason why they've got the Williams brothers is they both played in the Basque system. So yeah, they're going to have to go. This recruitment policy cannot be sustained anymore. But ironically, Bilbao, the first manager was English, and they were set up with English involvement. So there you go. And I will get into their history as well. Yeah, Real Sociedad couldn't sustain it. Look where they are now. They're not in the same. They realised very, very quickly in the modern era it could be sustained. But Bilbao, I think, have done it a lot better. Their talent scouting is fantastic. Um, and their player development's fantastic as well. Would I say Bale was a success at Real Madrid? On a playing standpoint, individually, he had some highlight reel goals, and he did, win them individual games like clutch goal scoring. Um, but in the whole time of his spell there, he spent more time playing golf. And it was a very disruptive spell in the dressing room. He didn't have a good relationship with the press, various managers, and the fans. But I think the media have portrayed it in a false narrative, uh, very anti-Bale. I don't think he helped himself with his constant trips to the golf course and some of his demeanour at the club. I don't think he endeared himself. Yes, we know he can actually speak Spanish, but I think he realised very, very quickly it's a toxic fan base, toxic media, toxic club. But at the same time, when he was fit and focused, he could do fantastic things. He showed that at Southampton as a young player, which attracted the attention of Spurs. Now, his time at Spurs was mixed. This is the thing. He had those individual games that when he transitioned from a left back, left winger to a left wing back, should I say, to a more attacking position, which I think is what Alexander Arnold's got to do at Liverpool in order to replicate what Bale did for Spurs. Because I think Alexander Arnold is better as an offensive weapon than a defensive side of the game. His first 50, 60 odd games for Spurs, whenever he played, they lost. They didn't win, basically. But then, for some reason, I can't remember if it was Martin Yole or Harry Redknapp, realised that if they played him, something happened in training where they took players out of their comfort zone and forced something. It was realised very, very quickly. I think in pre-season, one of the seasons, that he was quite good going forward and creating crosses and having shots on goal and creating chances. And it ended up that you know they went, well, you're very good going forward. Let's get you in a more attacking role. And I believe that they had an injury on the wing, and he was emergency. They win their first game with him in the side, and then they realised he's actually very good. I can't remember. I think it was Redknapp or Martin Yole realised very, very quickly that he was better going forward than defensively, and they evolved. He evolved from a wing back, like right or left back. I think he was a left back to he could play right back to a winger, an out and out winger, and then the rest is history. But primarily his role was wing back, and he wasn't good at the defensive side of the game, which then left the rest of the defensive back three, back four, back five, however they set up, very exposed because he's not very good at the defensive side of the game. Was it? Was it? I mean, yeah, he had those highlight reel goals and those clutch games when he was in the mood. Unfortunately, you could argue that his spell was mixed. I think it's the best way to look at it. I think there's been an agenda in the mainstream media, which I think we can all be guilty of as fans, going, okay, he spends more time on the golf course. And we had that little joke, that meme of when he signed in for LAFC. Someone posted a map of that part of Los Angeles with all the golf courses near the stadium where they play, and made that a bit of a joke. Um, I don't think that helped. Where when he wasn't playing, and there was allegedly he was injured, he was playing golf. I don't think that helped his image, his public image, to get the fans on side. Now for Wales, he's been brilliant for a long time. Although in the World Cup and in the last Euros, there were signs that was he truly focused, was he fully fit, was he at his best, that kind of thing. And you could argue he carried them there, but Aaron Ramsey and Josh Allen had a big part to play also in getting that Welsh side to the level they're at now. People have a go at Ramsey and Allen and all that. Um, and then their involvement in also being a big part to play in Wales's revival in the last decade, 15 years with their involvement. But Aaron Ramsey's involvement can't be understated either. Very key player. I think he was more of a leader for Wales than Bale, but that's personal opinion. Watching the amount of international football I have with tournaments, when Wales have played in tournaments, I felt Aaron Ramsey had a bigger imprint on the Welsh side than Bale. And Aaron Ramsey's had some horrific injuries that would have, in years past, he would have retired in decades past. Very young, so it's very good to see Aaron Ramsey still playing at a top level in his early 30s, considering he's broken his leg more than once. If he's playing in the 80s, if he's even playing in the 90s, that's his career done. The fact that modern science, modern medical science, and operation techniques, and have really come on leaps and bounds that he's still playing. Um, would I do a club history from the MLS? I've done some MLS videos. I can do more videos on the MLS and the game in North America. Obviously, I think obviously with a World Cup there in just over 3 years' time, I think that would be worthy of note. I could look at the various individual um, teams that make up the MLS, but it's still a rapidly expanding league, and I think we can look at the growth of the league. Um, you know, from the first ball being kicked and then the league being announced, the first ball being kicked to the teams we have now and the potential future expansion teams and when they're going to enter. I could definitely do a video on that. How popular that video will be, though, while the history videos and looking at individual leagues and moments in league history, um, they're fun to do. They don't get the views necessarily in the short term. That's what the algorithm looks for, is that short term spike. Some of the history videos have good long term views, and people are watching some of the club history videos from this time last year, and they do very well in the long term. But in the short term, that's what grows the channel and drives the channel growth. So it's those short 24 to 48 hour spikes. If they're not getting big spikes in viewership after then or by then in reality, does it help grow the channel? It might get a subscriber or a couple of new viewers, but well, we can look at the MLS and the MLS's future. Can the growth of the sport in the US be sustained post 2026? That's the important thing. Is the upcoming World Cup in 3 years' time? That is going to be the moment where we understand, where we see if the attendances are good. That's going to be crucial. How many fans go to World Cup games in 2026? And then what happens post 2026? Is there going to be another kick on with the MLS? And also, will the quality of the actual on-field product improve as well? Will more high-quality players from the European, South American leagues look at the MLS and go, actually, this is a decent quality of football? And will they go there not only to retire, but play the last season or two of their careers, but actually go there to go, actually, this is a good quality league. And then the actual quality of the league improve to a state where we're talking about it on the same level as the Premier League, La Liga, Serie A, the Bundesliga, that kind of level of the league. Could that be the potential of what the MLS want to happen? Because the MLS, their growth strategy has been around pure expansion. And while the MLS is a very entertaining product, it's not on the same level of fitness, skill level, and that elite mentality. Because most of the high profile players who go over there are either they didn't quite make it and they had a few injuries in the European leagues, they were injury disrupted, or they go over there very young, they didn't quite fulfill their potential in the elite European leagues, or they've only got a year or two left in their legs and they go in there to wind down their careers. And I don't think that necessarily helps grow their own. No, they're not. The Chivas are, I think two have folded in the history of the MLS. But Chivas, I mean, that doesn't really strike me as linking with a city a community within a city like Brooklyn, New York, for example. Doesn't really. The name doesn't help when you're trying to attract local fans to go to games. That doesn't help. But I can definitely look at the history of the MLS from expansion, the first initial the league starting to the various expansion rounds of expansion from each year, and go right this, because I've done a video on the MLS I think back in 2018 where I looked at the history of the MLS from foundation and the various levels of expansion going through to this when this club joins the league. This is the growth expansion. These teams came in this year. And I do believe I have covered that back in 2018, but we can do an updated one because more teams have since joined the league and the divisions and conferences have been altered to absorb the current expansion that we've seen. But when will they decide? Right, we're going to stop at let's say 32 teams. That's as far as we'll go. We'll stabilise, and then can the interest be maintained? Will fans continue to go to games? And that's the important thing: is how many fans are going to turn up when at the World Cup in 3 years' time. Miami Fuse, Tampa Bay. I mean, look, I don't remember these teams. That the early days of the MLS were fraught with financial instability and a lack of growth, and they chose the wrong stadiums to locate teams in. They didn't have football only stadiums; they had American football stadiums that they put teams in, and you've got like an 80,000 seater NFL style stadium with like 6,000 fans in. That's not a good look when you're trying to sell that to the TV audience, and it's going to cost a lot of money because you've got those vacant seats you haven't sold. It doesn't look good. And when you're trying to sell the product to new fans, going, look, there's no one in the stadium. It's going to put fans off going, well, that's just, there's no atmosphere. And so they went down the policy of, "Ooh, let's get a team to get a high profile player and we'll relax our import rules." And David Beckham was the player. David Beckham is the player. That moment saved the MLS from basically becoming another failed North American soccer league, basically. The David Beckham signing for LA Galaxy is the key moment where the fortunes of the MLS change, and suddenly, fans are turning up not to necessarily watch their team play, to watch David Beckham play, and then other high-profile players like Kaká, Pirlo, Steven Gerrard, Ibrahimovic, obviously in more recent years, have gone over, and with players like Ibrahimovic and Beckham, they prolonged their careers by going to the MLS by several years. Because when they sign people, they're done. They're injury, especially Beckham. He was had a lot of injuries. He wasn't quite the same player he was at his peak at Manchester United. Ibrahimovic, people saying, "Oh, this is going to be his retirement. He's going to retire at LA Galaxy. His knees are shot. He barely played for Man United the last season." He goes there. He's since won more silverware, and he's playing in his early. He hasn't retired yet. So when people criticise the MLS, it prolonged Beckham's career, it prolonged Ibrahimovic's career. They go back to Europe, continue playing in the top leagues in Europe, following playing in the MLS. Yeah, no, David Beckham did become a very the way his brand was marketed, like especially during the treble '99 era. So when United win that treble in '99, he burst really onto the scene with the goal against Wimbledon in 1990. I think it was in '96. He chipped Sullivan from over the halfway line, and that became the goal of the season. That was marketed to death. Obviously, the '98 World Cup, the US did have a team that went to that '98 World Cup. We lost to Iran, by the way. Very, very interesting. So the US audience were watching that because of the '94 World Cup. So there was a US audience. And of course, he gets sent off, and that becomes very controversial. The following year, United win the treble, including the Champions League final. And then, of course, his marriage to Victoria Beckham, Posh Spice. And because the Spice Girl had exploded in the US in popularity, because he was linked with a musician, a very popular pop star, that generated its own publicity, not only here in the UK, but across the world, especially in the US, in all the gossip mags. And then suddenly he becomes the face of Calvin Klein, becomes the face of, I think it was Gillette or Wilkinson Sword. And then he does all these advertising campaigns for US companies. And then he's all over all the billboards in Times Square. He's all over the billboards in Rodeo Drive, and all these advertising campaigns that went to a global audience. And he becomes a global superstar. He already was. That goal against Wimbledon helped cement that. The '99 treble winning team helped cement that, and how the Premier League started marketing itself because of some of these highlight reel goals of Di Canio, Beckham, Tony Yeboah. How suddenly, you know, some of these highlight reel goals that were scored in the '90s. When I go, the '90s was peak Premier League and peak football. These European games. Suddenly, you get that interest over in the US. The MLS obviously is in its infancy. It is struggling in its infancy. Clubs did go out of business. Clubs did relocate. There were some struggles in filling stadiums. Then you have David Beckham, and you have the 2002 World Cup as well, which is very, very important. Again, the US, Brad Friedel and co, they actually have a really good World Cup, if I remember rightly. They make the knockout stages. And you have, um, his time at Man United. There's question marks over his relationship with Alex Ferguson. That's all in the mainstream media. His brand has been in marketing overdrive. He's got the Calvin Klein. He's got all these contractual arrangements with all these overseas, major companies. Fergie's not liking some of these third party arrangements, and he ends up signing for LA Galaxy, which is ridiculous. At the time, people laughed at it. People were saying, "Oh, his career's done. He's too interested in his wife. There's the allegations of his extramarital affairs, or his private life." Um, and he buys into the American way of life. He buys into the American style of sport. He now owns a football team in the MLS, ironically, in Miami. But because he was branded so well and some of his third party sponsorship arrangements with these companies were so lucrative, it made him a face people recognise. I mean, this is the early days of the internet, and social media is just starting to start up in tech, Silicon Valley in California, and then suddenly, bang. And the moment he decides to sign for LA Galaxy, leave Man United, well, he went to Real Madrid for a bit, and of course the Latin American community. There's a big, Latin American community in the US. He leaves Man United, goes to Real Madrid, the Galacticos. Of course, their branding is global. Manchester United branding is global. Goes there. That's a big money move. Does it really work out? Does you could argue the same with David Beckham at Real Madrid. Did his spell work out well? He's the Gareth Bale of British football of his era. It's the moment he leaves Europe, signs for LA Galaxy. His agent loving it, and that is the moment the MLS is saying, without David Beckham going there and signing there, we don't have other players like Ibrahimovic's and your Kakars, these players who could have continued playing in European football and retired in Europe. Ibrahimovic prolonged his career. You don't have the Andrea Pirlos, the Gerrards, that kind of level of player who've won the big trophies in Europe going. The Lampards. That is the moment that saves the MLS. And then other big name players grow on, build upon that. So Beckham's the first. Ibrahimovic is the other big one as well. Before Bale comes on, they're the players that I think have raised the MLS's profile because, apart from Bale, obviously, the other two prolonged their careers by playing there and by many years. But yeah, I actually the Beckham cologne's actually quite nice, and aftershave is quite nice. And again, and now he's an owner of a team in the MLS. And he's been very, very a big driving force about growing the game and the league in the US and Canada. But without David Beckham as a team owner and firstly as a player, the MLS is not in the position it is now. Could it have struggled to survive? Possibly. I think David Beckham saves the MLS from an abject failure, in my opinion. But yeah, Wimbledon did suffer a lot of classic world-class goals against them. The US squad for the 2002 World Cup, you had Berhalter. Claudio Reyna was a fantastic player. Injury really hampered his career. If you're a Man City fan, you'll remember that. Brad Friedel, I'm a Blackburn fan. He was beloved. Casey Keller, the losing goalkeeper in that League Cup final. Brad Friedel, the winning goalkeeper in that League Cup final in 2002. There you go. Both American goalkeepers were on opposite sides in the 2002 League Cup final. DeMarcus Beasley, he was a fantastic player. Brian McBride was a hard-nosed centre forward. Landon Donovan was very young in that team. Kobe Jones. A lot of these players, a fair few of those players, played in the Premier League. That was that was possibly the best USA national side you've ever seen. I mean, in my opinion, the goalkeepers were world class. That, in my opinion, is one of the best US squads we've ever seen, and a lot of that talent, shall I say, was playing in the European leagues at the time, either in England or in Germany. Fantastic squad they had in 2002. People don't realise how good that team actually was. If you Look at those players; they would be first team regulars in the Premier League now. I think Claudio Reyna, unfortunately, obviously injury really hampered his career, which was a shame because he was a very talented box to box midfielder. He was a heart and soul guy. Injuries really hurt his career and his career longevity. His career was hampered by injury. Bruce Arena, there's been a lot of talk about Bruce Arena as the head coach of the US and his coaching style, and was he good for American US football or bad for it? You know, I think with the resources the US had available at the time, and where the game was at the time to where it is now, if he was the coach now, I think you would see more of the US national side based in the MLS. You might see uh, even more talent. I think the Bruce Arena, when he handed over to Klinsmann, and I say that because Klinsmann obviously had to stick with the Germany setup. Jurgen Klinsmann, I think, on the international standpoint, with how the structures that the US soccer has put in place, um, and talent development. Hey, look, they went to that foreign coach idea. It worked for them. Honestly, going with the foreign coach really did actually work for the game in the US. The issue that the US has is the relationship between the MLS and the national side, and their federation, their association. That's, I think, where the structural issues and the struggles that the US game faces lie, is with that relationship between the franchise modelled MLS and then the minor league affiliates that are in place, and the minor leagues, the national side, and the US Soccer Federation, the USFA, basically, for a better word. That kind of relationship is where a lot of the issues with American football lie in the world, with the game in the States, and to a certain extent in Canada as well, lie. That it resolved those issues and those relationships suddenly. You know, those issues and the struggles. I mean, like not qualifying for the 2018 World Cup, for example. A lot of a lot of questions were asked about the relationship between the federation and the MLS, for example, and how they could better work together to talent pathways, player development, and structuring the season when World Cups are on, and CONCACAF tournaments, things like that, of working with the European players and making sure that the development and the releasing of players for international duty is there. Um, but 21 years ago they had a fantastic team. It's only recently that Landon Donovan and Dempsey have retired, and Friedel have retired. They've only retired in recent years. That is how good those players. I mean, Brad Friedel about 10 years ago, but Donovan and Clint Dempsey only retired in the last couple of years. Their longevity was, they had fantastic careers that were good longevity. And as I say, I mean, that squad, I think, looking at that squad and the, the imprint they had on the game, the fact that you could have a whole starting 11 plus a sub that were Premier League players, that's not including all European players, you know. And then out of that 2002 squad, those other players who were younger or fringe players who went on to play in Europe, I mean, that was the US version of the golden generation that we have in England. That was the US version at the same time. They had a good group of talent that all came through at the same time, within a decade or so of each other. And that's what we call a generational talent pool. And I think every sport and every country has that generational talent pool. That doesn't matter if it's one sport or a lot of sports that seem to come through roughly at the same time. The UK's had it in the various home nations where a group of athletes in a variety of sporting backgrounds seem to just come through at the same time, together. And so suddenly the profile of multiple sports is raised because of the success of individual athletes or teams. Yeah, look, Wales have had been very good at rugby union at the top level for a very long time, and in the last few years that's dropped off. But when it comes to association, yes, they have basically had this group of players that have come through together, roughly the same age, who all peaked roughly at the same time, and had a top level of talent. Ironically, Aaron Ramsey and Gareth Bale. I mean, Gareth Bale, Sam Warburton went to the same school as Gareth Bale in the same year. He was captain of the rugby union side, which got to a World Cup semi-final. Um, Injury curtailed his career very, very. He had to retire young because of injury. Um, that is very interesting. So, multiple sports had a generational talent pool in Wales over the last 10, 15 years that all came through at the same time. Then you look at, as I say, the class of '92 with Manchester United and how that ultimately positively impact English football in the '90s and the early 2000s. The class of '92 drove other clubs to also identify youth talent um, in the couple of years following. So yeah, at the class of '92, Scholes, Giggs, but Savage was part of the class, like Beckham. Um, and then you have players like Joe Cole and Frank Lampard at West Ham, which came through slightly after. Then you had Gerrard at Liverpool, Tony Hibbert at Everton. Because of the class of '92 at Manchester United, that impacted other rival clubs um, in the English game to also identify talent and draw that talent through. Um, and obviously, we look at the effects of that. Oh yeah, look, the World Cup squad in 2006. Yeah, Tim Howard, Casey Keller, and Marcus Hanneman. Surprised Friedel wasn't there, considering the level he was still playing at in the Premier League. But that's you know neither here nor there really. The level he was still playing at was fantastic, but he was one of the older keepers. And Casey Keller, he was right near the end of his career. But Tim Howard and Marcus Hanneman were the driving force behind the defence there. And and Tim Howard had a fantastic career. And Marcus Hanneman was a damn good goalkeeper in his time as well. Yeah, the 2003 World Cup winning team of England. The green shoots of that were in the mid '90s, ironically, with Matt Dawson and Johnny Wilkinson and co. That was a mid '90s. They became professionals in the mid to late '90s. They started to get first team rugby union, shall I say, in their late teens, early '20s. And with Wilson and Dawson, they became first team regulars at their clubs. The forward pack was a veteran forward pack: Martin Johnson, Jason Leonard, and you had these young, exciting back line, which was complemented by having Jason Robinson come over from rugby league. He had been a professional athlete for a lot longer than rugby union had been professional, because he was a league player in his youth and at Wigan when he was a bit younger, where they'd already been professional for a very, very long time. So he brought those professional standards with him with fitness, training. So you had youth and experience. So you had some veterans, and then you had some young, talented playmakers and outside backs with a battle-hardened forward pack. You get a World Cup winner. But that was a fantastic run. They've been building for several years, and then you get the right coaching setup, and the rest is history. And you peak at the right time as well, because you can have a talented squad like the golden generation of England, for example, and not get things right. Where in the World Cup and Euro cycle, you peak in qualifying and then struggle in tournament. And we can raise questions about Southgate and his tactical dealings and how he sets up tactically, but we shall see. The relegation battle, I think Leicester are done. I think Southampton are done. It's now between Forest and Everton. And obviously, what happens to Everton off the field with any punishment that Premier League and the FA deem fit for them, points deduction, for example, could have a part to play in the relegation battle. We may see court action yet. So we shall see what happens. But I think Southampton and Leicester are done. Everton, Nottingham Forest, we shall see. Oh, the West Indies cricket from the '60s to the '80s was ridiculous. England and Australia were really shit at the time, and it's people forget that South Africa at that time during apartheid, when they were banned from international sport, had the best players in the world, and they weren't allowed to play internationally. So imagine if South Africa had not been banned from international sport in the '80s and '70s. Their rugby union side would demolish the All Blacks every time. Um, their soccer team or football team, depending on what part of the world you're from, would have actually demolished a fair few countries at the time as well, because a whole and their cricket team was ridiculous as well. South Africa domestically, their sport was just ridiculous, and they were barred from competition because of government's policy on apartheid. And so the West Indies, for some reason, managed to dominate cricket because the South Africans were banned from playing. But Australia and England were really, and to a certain extent New Zealand were really bad at the time. India and Pakistan, dreadful away from home. Bangladesh was only admitted as a test nation in the early 2000s, I believe, and until the late 70s was part of Pakistan. Sri Lanka only got test status in the 90s. Zimbabwe, I think, were a test nation at the time, or were about to become a test nation. So really, it was the West Indies, England, Australia, New Zealand, and then India and Pakistan were dreadful away from home, and Zimbabwe were average. And so, yeah, the West Indies had less competition to play against, ironically, and the money side of the game with like things like the IPL and the big TV contracts and the centralised contracts weren't a thing at the time. So the West Indies were actually still able to compete on a level playing field financially with some of the what we now see as the top Test playing countries. Um, but yeah, like India, Pakistan did not travel well with their Test series when they played overseas. They were dreadful record, couldn't win at all. And but the West Indies could play at home in the Windies and play overseas in like places like Australia and New Zealand and England and India and Pakistan and just annihilate some of the best test players that those countries and had to offer. Yeah, the 80s Pakistani field hockey team just was terrifying. And they're not very good now. But it's like the Canadians and the Soviet, well, especially the Soviet Union in the 70s and the 80s. The Red Army team was just basically the Red Army team was the national side. Look at their record as well, and the old Czechoslovak national side in ice hockey. It was just the Summit series that they had in the 70s, where the individual NHL teams would play home and away. So they would have the Soviet Union team, Soviet Red Army team would come over to the US and Canada and play the Montreal Canadiens, the Philadelphia Flyers, the Boston Bruins, etc., etc., etc. The NHL teams, and then the best NHL teams would go over to the Soviet Union and try and play the Soviets in the Summit Series in the 70s. And very famously, I think they were playing the Philadelphia Flyers, and the Philadelphia Flyers were like, "Well, we're the Broad Street Bullies. We're going to do what we do against our regular opposition, which is the NHL. We're going to drop the gloves. We're going to get physical. We're going to fight them. We're going to hit them hard, hit dirty if we have to. We're going to basically physically intimidate the opposition because we may not be the most skilled." People forget the Broad Street Bullies of the 70s. They had some bloody skillful players. Let's not forget the Flyers were not just thugs. They had some very, very good players. And they basically were like, let's play our normal game. Physical, let's rough up the opposition and also do the skill side. They were just absolutely like steamroll teams, right? The Soviet team skated off the ice and refused to play. I think it was like in the first or second period of one of the games, like, we're not playing this. And then there was the Canadian Summit Series where the Canadian national side played the Soviets. And then there was the Miracle on Ice as well at the Olympics in Lake Placid. But the famous image of the Soviet-Canadian rivalry in the 70s with ice hockey, Phil Esposito is pointing, it's like you and me, and he's pointing at one of the Soviet players. I think one of the defensemen. He's on the bench. He's like, you, me, fight. And he's doing the old eyes, I want to fight you. And very quickly, the Soviets realised that you couldn't just rely on skill to beat the US and Canadian teams. You had to rely on physicality as well, because the Soviet game was all about skill and speed and skill. And then obviously the collapse of communism and then the end of the Soviet Union, and then obviously Alex McGillney's the famous one where the Buffalo Sabres snuck him out of the Soviet Union right near the end of communism, and they had to basically avoid the KGB basically, and they got McGilney, the Sabres organisation, and then you've got the Fedorov brothers, especially Sergei Fedorov, and then you've got some of the other the Russian Five in Detroit, and then they obviously paved the way for Alexander Ovechkin, and the rest is obviously the rest is history. Some of the Russian players like Shesterkin and Kuznetsov, and some of the other Russians that now do grace the NHL and Provorov and all that. But if it wasn't for Alex McGilney being smuggled out by the Buffalo Sabres, I believe it was in 1988 that the Buffalo Sabres had made contact with his family, saying, "We'll get you over to the US under the Iron Curtain. We'll get you out." And the KGB had obviously got word of like, okay, one of our star young forwards could be snatched from under our nose. And so he had extra minders. And so how they got him out is just it's like a video game basically. How they got him out, like a fantasy film, like The Bourne Identity. It really is ridiculous how the Buffalo Sabres. It was all cloak and dagger, and there could have been some serious consequences had they screwed it up. Because he defected, obviously. But communism collapsed shortly after that. But the Russian Five as well. Obviously, a lot of these Soviet players who did eventually remain Russian, but also some other Soviet Union like Belarus and Ukraine, Latvia, and all that. A lot of them came over much later in their careers. So they didn't grace the NHL as long. But the Summit Series, just look at some of the footage. There was also the World Juniors fight in 1988, where the announcers turned the lights on and off to stop them fighting because it just turned into a mass brawl. The Soviets had realised by the mid to late 80s you had to be able to fight as well and be physical and throw the big hits, sometimes dirty, to intimidate the opposition and the physical side of the game in order to win and beat the Canadians and beat the US. They'd obviously been hurt by the Miracle on Ice. They'd obviously had these moments in the Summit Series like Trejak, is it Vladislav Trejak in goal? Best goaltenders of all time. Barely, imagine him playing in the NHL. And then you had the Stasny brothers and how they came over. Imagine if they had come over when they first started playing, they would have ripped the NHL to pieces in the 80s and the 90s. But they came over again a bit later because of the Cold War. So I just imagine that. We always discuss, imagine putting a united Yugoslav football team together right now and how terrifyingly world class that would be. That's what Yugoslavia was like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, sporting wise. They were winning gold medals and world championships in a variety of sports and being competitive in finals. Do I remember the 99 West Indies Australia 5th ODI? I don't. I sort of vaguely have seen clips of it, but I was more focused on the England Test side at the time and the ability of just watching the home Test series that we had. I do remember the England West Indies series of, I think it was in the late 90s, I think it was 2001, where the West Indies had a historically low batting first innings score, and England also had a bad first innings score, and then it was just ridiculous with I think some of the lowest scores of a first inning of a cricket innings ever at Test level. Did I watch the Masters golf? No, didn't. Not a moment of it. I did see the trees fall over because of the high winds. And this is something that the Augusta National and the organisers of the Masters need to be aware of. This is several times we've seen multiple weather delays in recent years, where we've seen thunderstorms, the risk of hurricanes because they play in hurricane season. People got to remember the hurricane season starts now until October. So when the Masters is being played, it's the start of hurricane season. So there's that build-up of subtropical storms. And of course, the Masters is played down in Georgia. Georgia suffers from not only hurricanes but also tornadoes, and it's that start of storm season in the south of the US and on the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico areas. Those trees falling down were ridiculous. But it's been very noticeable that there's been a lot of weather delays in recent years at the Masters. That very high profile, especially in the last decade or so. Look, I didn't watch any of it. I'm not really up to date with some of the latest up and coming players. I've tuned out of golf in recent years. I think that the battle between the PGA and the LIV is so damaging for the sport. There's all the court actions that are taking place, the litigation. It's a mess. It's not a good image for the sport. It doesn't sell the sport to new or potential returning fans who may have been switched off by the quality's not that good. There's been a lot of individual player scandals involving players like Tiger Woods, for example, that again give that entitled male-dominated attitude of the sport. Um, and that image of that misogynistic, entitled, male-dominated sport where if you're a female fan or player, you're less welcomed. And while I don't get me wrong, if if I could watch all 4 days of the Masters, I probably would. Um, but I think all the issues going on with golf and its governance and the way it's structured and golf right now, and the attitudes of some of the players, as well as the administrators, and some of the issues that golf faces, and some of the attitudes within the sport towards minorities and women and stuff like that, it comes across as this stereotypical middle to upper class, predominantly white dominated sport, which it is. It's not necessarily the case because players like Tiger Woods and obviously Vijay Singh and some of these minority players of colour have obviously changed that you know, narrative in the last 20, 30 years. But in reality, we the sport is at a crossroads, and it's just got to this crossroads 20, 30, 40 years later than other sports had to, with the direction the sport's taking, money within the sport, who controls the sport, the governance side of it, the attitudes of players and fans and coaches and TV companies, the culture within the sport. It's reached this crossroads later than other sports, and other sports have gone through it and have come through it. But were they weakened as a result? Were they better as a result? That's something that golf needs to figure out. But unfortunately, some of the players are coming across as arrogant, self-entitled, and then negative headlines come out about player behaviour and some of the off-course scandals that damage the reputation of the sport, the image of the sport. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, when you're trying to win back fans and attract new fans and a new generation of fans and players, you know, you need. I think, well, that was terrestrial TV. Well, taking off terrestrial TV in the UK, yes, was well, a lot of golf. Okay, taking golf off terrestrial TV was an absolute stupid decision. Um, and a lot of questions have to be asked of that BBC executive decision that they took all those years ago to scale back their golf commitment when it came to live sports coverage. Um, and then I have to agree. Yes, that was same with cricket as well. Cricket's now coming up with the 100 format by the ECB as a knee-jerk reaction to falling viewership figures on Sky. It's a self-inflicted wound. Golf has also seen participation levels drop, and fans tune off. And again, it's a self-inflicted wound with what I think it was the European PGA, European Tour, basically, were the ones that with the Open and the Masters, at least two of the four majors that were always, and then the domestic tournaments like the Wentworth, or whoever does the Wentworth one, PGA at Wentworth. Some of these domestic, like the Open, some of these big golfing tournaments, taking them off free-to-air TV by the BBC was a dreadful decision. And when they decided to scale back their coverage of the Masters, another real poor move. And it's self-inflicted harm. It's the same. It's the same with cricket, with the ECB taking off terrestrial and going with Sky. That was a self-inflicted wound by another sport that saw the short-term financial gain and got greedy and saw the pound signs and saw the Murdoch money, as I call it, and didn't understand the full consequences that would have on attracting young people to want to play the game. They had an opportunity to continue with the TV arrangement of domestic test series being on free to air and the overseas test series in the winter being on Sky. And the damage that's done to cricket at grassroots level is, you cannot understate that. Yes, they've got more money going into the ECB's pocket, but not enough money going into the county game. and in the grassroots game as a result. And the viewership figures back that up, and the participation figures back that up. And the finances of the domestic game back that up. The ECB really have screwed up with their TV deal, and now they're under pressure to bring cricket back to free-to-air TV. And they go, "Oh, look at the 100." But no, that is not the answer. That is not the answer. It is a symptom of an organisation that shot itself in the foot um, over greed. And do you know where that saying "shoot yourself in the foot" comes from? It's a First World War saying of soldiers who would have self-inflicted wounds to get out of duty and get sent to the rear for a period or get sent home with that wounds so they didn't have to serve anymore. That's where that saying comes from. But yeah, no, it's a self-inflicted gunshot wound basically by the ECB. It's the same with taking the Autumn Rugby Union internationals off free-to-air TV and going to Amazon. We're seeing people roll back on their subscriptions rather than add to them. So I'm not sure how that works. And now we're seeing with what's going to happen with BT Sport being basically sold off by the BT group to basically US TV media firms and then merged with, and rebranded. We've seen with the collapse of ITV Digital and the collapse of Setanta in the last 20 years that free-to-air coverage is vital. Vital. Now, what happens to things like the World Cups and the Olympics? I think because they're classed as Category A, they have to stay on free-to-air coverage, even in part or in full. What that means for the Rugby League World Cup, because it's in France, hopefully that stays on free-to-air coverage in full. I think the BBC did a decent job with, obviously, the rearrangements they had to put in place. But if it goes to Channel 4 or ITV or Channel 5, I wouldn't be disappointed because it's still accessible. Although Channel 4 and Channel 5 need to massively improve their digital website sides of their live streaming because that is absolutely dreadful. But the Rugby Union and Football World Cups, the Euros, Six Nations, the other ones. I think the Six Nations, there's a debate whether it's a Category A or Category B. But there are certain things like the FA Cup which have to that have to stay on free to wear. Cannot go behind a paywall because of their categorization. Doesn't matter who the free to wear broadcaster is; they have to be accessible. And the reason why BT Sport got the Champions League and Europa League is because their finals are accessible and are not blacked out on YouTube on social media. That is the only reason that they still exist on that finals basically are on social media. So that's how they got round putting them behind a paywall, which I thought was a ridiculous decision. Even Sky Sportsman, what do you do? The joint ITV package that we had works fine, and then the Europa League, which was partly on ITV, partly on Channel 5 and on Sky as well, they were like, why are we not continuing with what we were before with a joint free-to-wear subscription? Why is it going solely behind BT? That was a stupid decision by the broadcasters and a greedy decision by UEFA, how they sold the package and what they signed up for. It was ridiculous. And I think that's harmed football as well. And that's, I think, part of the reason why fans are starting to get more and more frustrated with how much it costs to watch your club, not only to go to games, but also if you can't go to games, which a lot of fans can't, accessing games on TV. And I think the movement pushback really came during COVID. After the resumption of play, when we saw the free-to-air coverage and the viewership figures of the Premier League on free-to-air coverage on BBC, ITV and all that, when the Premier League, the following season, when COVID really started hitting, when they brought out that pay-per-view fiasco, they were charging 15 quid for the privilege of watching Burnley, Bournemouth, or whatever it was, or Burnley, West Brom, when only 86 subscriptions were sold for that pay-per-view. And then they said, oh, it's for commercial reasons. No, honestly, that's a polite way of saying the fan backlash against this decision has been so severe that if we continue with this policy, we could risk long-term whole groups of fans going, sod this, we're turning our backs on the sport. And then now there's the question mark over the 3 p.m. blackout being scrapped as well. It was briefly scrapped with the resumption of play. at the end of the 2019-2020 season. Fans have had enough of that. Fans are getting pissed off with the change of kickoff times to suit the US TV audience. So the evening kickoff on a Friday, for example, everyone hates that. The lunchtime kickoff on a Sunday, everyone hates that, apart from those at home. So the change of kickoff times for domestic and overseas TV audience are frustrating fans. Um, sports broadcasters and their relationship with the various sports leagues that they broadcast have been hammered over the last 10, 15 or so years. We are now seeing that pushback against subscription-only models for certain sports like cricket, like to rugby union to a sense. There's more club games now seeping back onto terrestrial free-to-air. Free-to-air, I think, is the term because terrestrial's gone now. Domestic is the term we use. Wimbledon, yeah, that's classed as a category A. Same with the Grand National. F1's interesting because that's now gone fully behind a paywall with Sky F1. And of course, the British Grand Prix was obviously meant to be Cat A, and now it's not classed as Cat A anymore because first the ITV, then the BBC, and now Channel 4 have lost the F1 rights to show live races. I don't think the British F Grand Prix, MotoGP as well. That used to be every race live on free to air. That's gone now. That's behind a paywall. People are saying, "Oh, the Drive to Survive on Netflix is really saying they brought a load of new fans to F1." No, it's brought a load of new American fans to F1. It hasn't actually had that impact in Europe because all the fans go, "Oh, they put behind a paywall." Not paying for that, and it's become a bit more of a circus. And people go, "Oh, F1's going from strength to strength." Yeah, in the US it is. That's why they're adding, I think, up to 5 US races on the calendar soon. Like they're going to Vegas soon on a street circuit. God forbid, because street circuits in the US just do not work. They only work with IndyCar, and even then, they're the IMSA series. Okay, I can get having the MX5 Cup on the support package, but in reality, street circuits don't really work that well. Look at the V8 supercars. Okay, Melbourne. I mean, obviously, I can't watch that race because it's on the F1 support package. But if Melbourne, the V8 Supercars ever gets taken off that support package and back to being a standalone event with the V8 Supercar support package, yeah, I could. Albert Park works for the V8 Supercars, doesn't work for F1. Although this last race was a load of chaos, and the '96 race was a load of chaos. In reality, the Australian Grand Prix is really crap. But there's a couple of races in my lifetime that have been crashes all over the place, red flags, restarts. I remember back in the day in the 90s in F1, you had the spare car in the 90s. So when Martin Brundle decided to write off his Jordan twice at the same corner and cause a red flag and then a race restart, and he jumped in the spare car, he broke 2 cars that day in the space of an hour. Martin Brundle, one of the most how he got a drive in F1 is beyond me. As a commentator and as a pundit, I'd rather gouge, rip my ears off, stab my eyes out than listen to him and just scream, do an Oedipus because Jesus, Martin Brundle, painful. His grid walks are painful. His interview techniques are painful. He's just some ex-sport stars who go in the media shouldn't do it. Martin Brundle is one of them. God no. The Rugby World Cup does start, I believe, mid-September. But look what's happening in France right now. I mean, a lot of people are questioning giving France the Olympics, giving them the Rugby Union World Cup because of look what happened at the Champions League final last year, the disorder scene outside the stadium, the constant political protests that have been a constant for anytime there's a protest in France. If you want to have a riot, how the French do it. They really know how to have civil disorder on an epic industrial scale. But there's a lot of issues with a lot of ongoing strikes at the moment. We think we've got it bad with strikes here. At least our strikes haven't turned violent like they have in France. So they've got the upcoming Rugby Union World Cup, they've got the Olympics, and then the Rugby League World Cup in the space of 3 years. But then you look at the ongoing political and social unrest in France, it makes what's happening here look like we've just got a really dodgy government, and the French is something else. Really is something else. And then there's an ongoing strike about the waste, residential and commercial waste collections in Paris. Paris stinks as a city right now. It's a mess. Their government's even more unpopular than our government. Let's let that sink in. People don't realise what's going on, but the French know how to riot. So can you imagine the scenes when Rugby Union World Cup goes there and there's strike action, there's travel chaos, the infrastructure grinds will halt with trains, planes, trams, metro. Can you imagine if the French toll motorways, if the French go, oh, we're not going to work today, it'll be carnage, it'll be embarrassing, and it'll be kind of funny. Um, and these ongoing protests against the Macron government go back to like 2018. The yellow vest protests continue constantly, don't get the news coverage, but they are a background. They only stopped because of COVID. Then they started up again as soon as relaxations came in. They're part of this kind of protest movement. The trade unions, you have like race-related riots. Um, Basically, since like Chirac onwards, it's just been it's been Mitterrand even. My youth, every year there's a riot in France. Um, there's been, right. I remember in 2005. I think it was about September, October time. There was anti-police riots, and it was due to a couple of young teenagers were chased by the police in a very run-down district of Paris, and one of them died, or two of them died. I can't remember. And it was a bit, it's a dubious circumstances. France rioted. Like, it started in Saint Denis in Paris, and it spread to every major city in France within hours. And I remember it was the group stages of the Champions League and what was the UEFA Cup, which is now the Europa League at the time. And there were English clubs having to play group stage matches or knockout matches as the UEFA Cup was at the time in France. And the security, the atmosphere in stadiums was very, very hostile. And it was unknown. And they were concerned about, should we suspend games? Do we rearrange them? So the visiting teams actually play at home and the French teams play away while this is going on. And it was quite nasty. There was a lot of nastiness and unrest. And then we saw the yellow vest movement there, and it's been constant. I mean, how did we used to have two group stages because there was the initial threat of a European-style Super League back in the 90s, and the English clubs were readmitted to Europe. So as soon as the European ban for English clubs was lifted, and how they tweaked the UEFA coefficient, I think it was 1997. They 92 they rebranded it as the Champions League from the European Cup, or the Champions Cup, or the Cup, right? 97. Well, I think it was 97. After the 96 season, the Premier League shrinks to 20 teams, and the European ban is fully lifted for all English clubs. Liverpool are now allowed back into Europe, and so they had to restructure because all these English clubs were allowed back in. And then in '99 was the last year of the Cup Winners' Cup, and certainly certain qualification criteria for the Champions League, or what was the UEFA Cup. So they've merged two cup competitions together. The English clubs are allowed back in, and that's basically why we had two group stages, and why the Champions League has had several format changes, and why the Europa League is rebranded to the Europa League, and why they now have a group stage, and why the Conference League now exists. The Conference League is basically to fill in the gap of what was the Cup Winners' Cup. It's just a different name. 20 odd years later, they realised we made a mistake. We shouldn't have got rid of the Cup Winners' Cup, and the UEFA coefficient and the European ban on English clubs being lifted. That's basically why we had two group stages for a while. It's a shambles. It should never have happened, but because of the ban following Hazel and Hillsborough and all that, basically Liverpool getting all the English clubs banned because Liverpool fans couldn't behave in Belgium. Basically, and UEFA being very reactionary, thinking, hooligan elements, it's just an English problem, which it isn't, because the French, the Dutch, the Italians and the Germans have proven otherwise for 30 years, as have the Eastern Europeans since the end of communism. Let that sink in. But because the media and what happened at Hazel, it was a very reactionary response to the disorder. And then the European hardcore ultras went, we like what these English fans are doing. They don't come out. We'll get equally as intimidating. We'll learn. But no, the reason why we had two group stages is when that ban's lifted and the Cup Winners' Cup, when they announced that the Cup Winners' Cup will be merged into the UEFA Cup following the '99 season. That was the last year the Cup Winners' Cup was played for. They had to restructure, and then we, see the group stages brought in for what is now the Europa League, extra qualifying rounds, the change of the UEFA coefficient, how that impacts what clubs qualify, the fair play rule. We've got Fulham getting in under the FIFA fair play rule for the fewest red cards and yellow cards in the season. Fulham get in, the ending of the Intertoto Cup. So we've seen various structural reforms of European club football at the European, competition level, and now we brought in the Conference League to bring back the Cup Winners' Cup. They should never have scrapped that competition, really. But too many clubs that were in the UEFA Cup and Champions League were winning the domestic cup competitions, but it has devalued them completely. To be honest, I don't really remember the structure of the second group stage. Really, I just remember watching games as a kid, and not really caring if it was a group stage game or a knockout stage game. I just enjoyed watching the football, regardless of the European competition that I was watching as a kid. I remember Tuesdays and Wednesdays was Champions League nights, and Thursdays was UEFA Cup or Cup Winners' Cup nights, and I was allowed to stay up. Depending, because I used to stay at my grandparents' a couple of nights a week when I was a kid, because my mum went to evening classes for her accountancy. So in the 90s, I used to I think a couple of nights a week. I think on a Monday and a Tuesday, I used to stay at my grandparents, and sometimes on a Wednesday and a Thursday, depending on how her classes were structured at the local college. Um, Depending on what course she was having to do and what year it was, it depended on what nights I ended up staying at my grandparents. And then by when was it? It was about 2000, I believe. My mum had got all her qualifications, or the late 90s, about 99. It was around the time of the treble winning season of Manchester United. It was around the 99 2000 period that my mum had got all her qualifications, I seem to remember. But it was always seemed to be the European club games that I was staying at my grandparents'. So I was allowed to stay up a little bit late and watch a lot of the group stage games as they were at the time, or the early stages of the UEFA Cup or the Cup Winners' Cup. By the time of the knockout, the later knockout stages of the Cup Winners' Cup and UEFA Cup, um, they were in half terms. They were in school holidays, basically, and it was the end of the school year. You had, you know, and I went to boarding school, so I obviously, or not boarding school necessarily, but private school. So our school holidays are slightly different, slightly longer because we had Saturday school and all that. But basically, um, the European nights were you were allowed to stay up late, and then obviously I moved in with my grandparents in 2006. I left school, I went to local college, and so every night from Tuesday to Thursday, from August when the early qualification rounds through till May, European football 3 nights a week was on the TV, and then it went behind a paywall, which was for me one of the worst decisions that was ever taken. I understand, yes. I remember when Leeds got to the Champions League semi-final, and then two seasons later, they're relegated out of the Premier League. So that's sinking. Yes, they are changing the format. The Swiss model works for ice hockey and basketball because you can play back-to-back games on back-to-back nights. So you can have that kind of competition bracket because it works in a short time frame for like March Madness in the NCAA and basketball, the NCAA ice hockey, how certain European ice hockey and basketball tournaments, their postseason playoffs take place. It makes sense for a short, sharp tournament because ice hockey and basketball, if you look at the NHL and NBA, you have back to backs. You can sometimes have 3 or 4 games in like 5 days for an NHL team or an NBA team because you have that rotation of players. In the NHL, you roll 4 scoring lines and 3 defensive pairings, and you can have 2 goaltenders who might play in the same game. So out of the 20 players that are selected on the bench, all 20 might play in that game. Your average ice hockey shift is around 30 to 60 seconds a shift. You don't very rarely you might have a player double shift, which could be up to 2 minutes ice time. Some players in an entire 60-minute game may only be on the ice for like 7 minutes. Yeah, you can play back-to-back games. It's how the back-to-backs work. You can play 3 games in 5 days. That's how that Swiss model works. It does not work for football. It doesn't work for rugby union. It doesn't work for rugby league because the physical. You see how when you have fixture congestion in European club football when it comes to playing cup games, European games, and domestic league games, you might see teams play 3 games in like 7, 8 days, and they have to rotate the squad, which is why squad depth becomes important. You won't see them play, 3 games in less than 7 days. So the Swiss model, yeah, I'm not sure it works for football. Notice it's not used for rugby union or rugby league, but it's used for those team sports where you can play multiple games in a week, like especially back-to-back format. It does not work for. While it might work for basketball and ice hockey, those sports, it makes sense to use the Swiss model, especially if you've got a playoff structure. Does not make sense if you've got to combine European club games with domestic cup and league games. It actually weakens the domestic leagues and weakens, especially domestic cups will get weakened as a result, which is another reason why we're seeing the reduction of replays in the FA Cup and the change of the League Cup structure completely over the years. We have seen a complete change in the model because of the constant changes to the European club games. This is why we've seen the scrapping of League Cups. Like, I think Germany and France, they're gone. And I think can't remember if it's France or Germany that have voted to shrink their league down to 18 teams. It could be Serie A. It's one of the top leagues in Europe has decided to shrink the size of their league from 20 to 18 teams. The Germans already have an 18-team league. I think the leagues themselves, if they vote to reduce, they're going to get less TV money because you've got less games you can sell for the TV and media rights streaming partners. But there's got to come a point where we go, hang on, we've got the European club game wrong, and we've got the domestic cup competitions wrong, and there has to come a point. I don't. Yes, I would. Yes, I would be annoyed. Yes, I think it weakens the competition, um, and ironically, it would actually hurt revenues because you would have to charge more for tickets and then you reduce the competition level where you've got to spread the talent around. Really, look at what's happened in Scotland. How 2 clubs dominate, and you play. You would, I think the smallest realistically you can go to before you have to start playing rival clubs 3 or 4 times a season is I think 16. Um, I remember the 22-team format, but we didn't have European club games to play in the first 3, 4 seasons of the Premier League's existence. They stuck with the old Division One model. Got Liverpool to thank for that. And UEFA's knee-jerk reactionary response. They should have just banned Liverpool. They did a blanket ban for all English clubs, which is why Scottish clubs had that little bit of boost for another brief period in their quality north of the border. But no, jokes aside, in order for that to happen, you would have to scrap the League Cup, completely scrap FA Cup replays. You could go back to the 2014 model as well. And you would then have to put pressure on UEFA to restructure the European Cup competitions back to straight knockouts. And the amount of money the English game brings into European football is ridiculous. The amount of eyes on the product because the English clubs are competing in Europe is ridiculous. It adds, further value to the Champions League, Europa League, and Conference League because the English clubs are involved in latter stages quite regularly and get to finals. I mean, obviously in the Conference League we've only had the one final, but I believe Leicester got to the semi-final in that competition, and West Ham are going quite well in the Conference League right now. I wouldn't like to see the domestic and European Cup scrapped, but I fear we are devaluing the domestic cup competitions because of the constant fiddling with the European uh, cup formats that we have. I think UEFA have got the Champions League, Europa League, and Conference League formats wrong. I think they've gone over quantity over quality. And look at the amount of dead rubbers in the group stages that no one cares about. They've gone for the massive TV revenues. They've basically gone for the money over the product, basically. They've saturated the product, they've cheapened the product, um, and they've devalued the product, in my opinion. It's the same clubs that always get to the last stages. Maybe you get a handful of new clubs that might make a first quarter final, the first semi final, or a final. For the first time in a generation, for example, the first time ever, like Villarreal winning the Europa League a couple of years ago. But in reality, it's the same clubs that regularly have European success and have done since 1992. Um, and I think that devalues it as well when you don't get that Steaua Bucharest story or that Olympic Marseille story where they go on a run and win. You know, it's the only time that a club from their country's won that silverware, or a Hamburg where they win what is now the Champions League. When you lose that underdog story, it doesn't. It actually harms the image. When you've got the same like 16 clubs that always seem to make quarterfinals onwards, it's not. It's not. And the UEFA coefficient is part of the problem with that. I think the League Cup, putting it behind a paywall, was a big mistake and devalued it. But then losing the Cup Winners' Cup devalued the League Cup 25 years ago. No, there's a lot of big clubs in the Bundesliga. I think the Germans, with their promotion relegation structure, they decided, obviously for whatever reason, to structure it with 18 in the top flight. But they've got a very solid domestic TV deal. They've got a very solid fan involvement in the running of their clubs. I think it's also to reduce prices or whatever. The fans are involved. It's to reduce away days. It's a very more fan-focused, orientated league. It really is. They haven't chased massive amounts of money. The fans have a big say with the 50+1 rule. But yeah, I wouldn't say they're too dominant. They've just been very, very well run over the last 40 years. Since the 70s, well, since the late 70s, basically, Bayern have been exceptionally well run. Before 1970, Bayern won nothing. It was Borussia Mönchengladbach in the 70s that won everything. People go, Borussia Mönchengladbach are destroying German football. We're having the same argument again. Germany's been successful before Borussia Mönchengladbach and before Bayern Munich had their dominant spells. You look at the history of the Bundesliga. Bayern, when I get to the Bayern video, they don't win their first Bundesliga title until bollocks. Is it the 70s? Is it the 1970 odd season? Something like that. They don't suddenly start winning until the 70s. Yeah, B teams, just because they still have a strong reserves competition. We don't have that in English football anymore. We scrapped the reserves. Following, the reserves is not a thing really anymore. Whereas in Spain, well, because we've got so many professional clubs anyway, the talent pool was more distributed around the professional leagues at all levels. Whereas in Spain, in Germany, in Italy, the lower levels, sometimes you need a reserve team to get a run out, and they're not allowed to get promotion or relegation. They're just allowed to go, right, you're playing at this level. And their B teams, just get thrown into the various leagues so their players just get a run out of get some match fitness. Spain, especially, you'll notice in the lower levels, you'll have Barcelona, Real Madrid, Bilbao, Valencia, all the big Atletico, all the big name teams in La Liga will have a B team now, or even a C team and a D. Some of them have so much depth in recruitment that they can put out a C team, for example, or a D team. That's including under 21s and under 18s. And so that's ridiculous. No, I don't like it either. I think that's a problem with the depth of Spanish and German football and Italian football past like the third tier down. Don't have a depth. Same with French football. After the second tier, French football's pub league. So when we talk about like elite leagues, we have the most depth in Europe. Like our professional, we're going down to National League North and South for when it goes semi-pro. There are professional teams in National League North and South. That is ridiculous. We don't get fully semi-professional till below that, where there's no professional teams with this. But even then, there's professional players in the non-league in the Isthmian League on full-time contracts. Let that sink in. Um, it is ridiculous. The fact we have 92 Football League and Premier League clubs, that's not including all the professional clubs in the non-league, which are fully professional. The majority of the National League is fully professional. I think it's like 3 clubs that are classed as semi-pro, and then towards the bottom. But the majority of the National League, and to be fair, a certain extent of the National League North and South are fully professional, which is ridiculous. We're talking the 6th tier. That's the level where we're still paying players around 20-25 grand a year to play. So that's the level we're talking about when it comes to the professional football player. Rugby league is different, but yeah, that's where we're talking. Some of these, journeyman European players will go, "Oh, I'll sign for a Championship or League One club," because they can actually get game time. They can play. It might be for a season on a free transfer, but they can play. They've been released by a Spanish or Italian or a French club, German club, but they want to keep playing. They go on their agent, "You just find me a club." Oh, we found you a club in England. Oh yeah, Forest Green Rovers. They are the first team officially relegated from a football league division. Um, it hasn't worked under Duncan Ferguson. The results haven't come. The gap between them and the teams above them has grown. Between them and Accrington, it's ridiculous. Um, and look, Forest Green Rovers. I think they've reached their level. I think League Two is as best as they can hope for. It's not been a great season. No, look, they've got a few more fans than that, but the fact they can't even sell out their 5,000 capacity stadium now, and they want to double the capacity in a new stadium down the road. That I don't think Dale Vince lives in the real world. I don't think he knows what's going on. Really, Dale Vince is a lunatic. He's one of those owners that he I look. I think it's fantastic the Forest Green Rovers, even without Dale Vince, have done and achieved what they've achieved. Um, but then they do have a limited local fan base. That doesn't mean they can't attract fans from around the country and around the world. But yeah, they should really be Nailsworth Football Club, really. Um, but no, Forest Green Rovers. I mean, look, that problem is the owners' ambitions are out are there. Unfortunately, the squad they've assembled is the problem. It's not the size of the ground. It's not the size of the fan base. It's the squad that was assembled for this season is just not up to League One standard. That has been clearly highlighted. Hiring Duncan Ferguson to fix it and save them has not worked. I don't think he's there next season. And then what happens in League Two? Did they overachieve in League Two? Are they really a non-league side that have overachieved? Could you argue that they're similar to what Yeovil Town did when they got into the Football League and then overextended themselves in the Championship? Are they reality an overachieving non-league side? Forest Green, I think it's the part of the village of Nailsworth. It's the name of the green, basically. Forest Green Rovers. It's Forest Green. I think is a part of the village, basically, in Nailsworth. It might be named after a local farm, I believe, where the stadium's built. Forest Green Farm might have been where they ended up getting the land to build the stadium. That kind of thing. Port Vale are the only club in the Football League that don't have a place name or some kind of historical place name in their name, because Arsenal used to play at the Woolwich Arsenal. That's where they were formed. That's their link to their heritage. Port Vale do not have a place name. Forest Green is I think one of the local farmers. The name was Forest Green Farm. Gave them the land to build it. I think that's how they get the name. But in reality, they're basically a non-league side who overachieved in the Football League, much like Yeovil Town, and unfortunately they've overachieved. That's caught up with them. It's been a disaster in League One, and I fear that their stay in League Two next season is going to be a season, and they're going to be back in the non-league, and it's going to be disastrous. And I can't see Dale Vince He obviously wants to build this new stadium and expand the stadium. They can't fill the current stadium they have now. And their record attendance came when I still believe they were a non-league club. So, and that was in an FA Cup game against Derby County, I believe. So I don't know um, um, what they do. I wouldn't call them a pub team. I joke when I call them that in their club history video. But truth be told, Dale Vince is one of those owners where you have to raise a question mark about, is he really, with the reality of where the club are at? They cannot fill their current stadium. Their vegan only policy, I believe, is technically football clubs don't really come under the Workers' Rights Acts and the various health and safety at work acts because it's professional sport. Um, but like Forest Green Rovers, I think, yeah. But hashtag United are not a non-league club; they're not a football league club. Hence why I said Port Vale's the only football league club with no place name or linked to a place name in the title. Whereas Arsenal goes back to the Woolwich Arsenal days with the foundation of the club. Yeah, the YouTube as well. We've mentioned them earlier. Hashtag United and Ballers FC. I, you know, yeah, they're all in the non-league. But no, Forest Green Rovers. I mean, they've been around a very, very long time. The problem with Forest Green Rovers, not only do they play in a very rural part of the country, they play in a part of the country that is rugby union and cricket country. So they're not going to attract the fans to football because most of the young people, when they go through the sporting systems, end up playing rugby union and cricket. And then they're the sports that are most followed. It's the same with like West Country, which is rugby union. Somerset's obviously a cricketing county, but rugby union. Um, how high? Well, look, hashtag United are now entering the Isthmian League for next season. Look, I think Solihull Moors, for a start-up team in 2007, have reached the National League. And the fact that Forest Green Rovers have even reached the Football League is ridiculous. I mean, Yeovil Town have got a much bigger fan base. They can sell out Hughes Park. They did get to the Championship. Luton Town are on the cusp of potentially making the Premier League, considering that around, I think it was about 10, 15 years ago, they were in the National. So to get from non-league to Premier League or Championship level, I think Yeovil's one of the quickest to do it. And Luton Town, should they make the Premier League, have done it in a very short space of time. Should they? Not saying they will make it out of the playoffs, but they're going to be in the playoffs. Whether they win the playoff final, we could have the potential of having Kenilworth Road, as we said earlier, as a Premier League stadium, which would be fantastic. It would be hilarious. There's a potential of Millwall making the Premier League. Just imagine that. The last time they were a top flight side, I believe, was the 1987-88 season. Was the last time. Roughly the same time that Luton were a last top flight side was in the 80s. Same with Oxford United. We can you imagine Luton, Millwall? Christ, that would be ridiculous. And Millwall being a London club and Luton not being that far from London, Wembley would sell out within an hour. They would sell that game out. Whereas if let's say Blackburn and Middlesbrough were to do it, while the game would sell out, and they are much bigger clubs with much more history and more silverware, more success, I would argue that Millwall, Luton probably sell out quicker. But the last time those two clubs were in the top flight was the 80s, whereas Middlesbrough and Blackburn have been in the top flight more recently and have won silverware, actual silver. Luton have won. Millwall are the only of the four in the current playoff places that have never won silverware, or a major honour like a league title or a cup piece of silverware. But imagine that. Can you imagine? I mean, Millwall have only played one season in Europe as well. The others have played more seasons in Europe. So that's again another topic of debate. But can you actually imagine Luton, Millwall? Can you imagine the West Ham Palace punch ups? That's going to be ridiculous. But imagine Luton. I mean, that's just going to be something with Kenilworth Road. But there are plans for a new stadium at Luton. Whether they actually come to fruition and actually they build that stadium is another thing. I believe it was 3 seasons Millwall had in the top flight in the 80s. Can I imagine like hashtag United or Ballers FC making Football League? They might go through a name change, and they obviously need to find a much more suitable ground to meet Football League standards, whether that means they have to ground share with another Football League club. Uh, but could they get enough fans really to sustain themselves? They'll get the social media attention, but would they actually get enough fans week in, week out where they can sustain themselves and be profitable? And that's before we even get an owner to back them. While it may seem like it may seem like a success now. In reality, um, they won't. If they do make the Football League, then we'll see a complete change of club dynamics in professional football in this country. We'll see a complete change. Um, but look at Forest Green Rovers with Dale Vince. I think they've run their race, and they've only been a Football League club for a handful of seasons. Um, Now, whether they are a League Two club and that is their limit, but look what happened to Rushden and Diamonds. They don't exist anymore. And they were, what is now the National League Conference, League Two. They don't exist anymore. They were they were a merger of two clubs to become Rushden. I mean, I have to do a video on Rushden and Diamonds. That would be a fantastic video. Look at the history, look at the failure, and why, they don't exist anymore, why the stadium is gone. Gone. Not even left to rot anyway, demoed it. But Scarborough, Chester, Hereford, established non-league and football league sides that we know about. How many clubs emerges? I think Dagenham and Redbridge, I think, is one. Historically, Walsall, several clubs merged together to form Walsall. Hayes and Yedding, yeah. Yedding was it Yedding United and Hayes Town? Hayes and Yedding merged together to survive, and because they were both in the same local area, so it made sense. I believe Newcastle. Newcastle United historically, the reason why that club exists is Newcastle West End and Newcastle East End merged. Multiple clubs in the Football League now, in the Premier League now, their origin story going way back when. Having Waterlooville, obviously the and gives it away, obviously. But no, some of the big clubs now that are like in the Premier League and Football League now are mergers. And Newcastle United, their origin story is a merger between two clubs in Newcastle. Walsall's another one where multiple clubs merged together, and they're big Football League examples. When we talk about Hayes and Yedding, Hayes and Yedding's quite recent, but having a Waterlooville is a long time ago. Oh no, Brighton Hove Albion has always been a singular club, just because they got the and in the name. They've always been a that's the name. It's just Brighton and Hove because of the merger of the two towns to form the city of Brighton and Hove, because they get city status. But no, it was always Brighton, and then it became Brighton and Hove when Hove got absorbed by Brighton as a community. But the club itself has always been a singular. It's never a merger. There's quite a few. Do mergers work? Well, I think Walsall and Newcastle United would say yes. Having Waterlooville, I mean, yeah, they were a solid non-league side. Hayes and Yedding, I remember they were actually separate teams. It depends on the sport. It depends how well done the mergers are and how they bring the club administration together, and how they work in combining two clubs or three clubs in some cases into one united kind of one unit over multiple. Because in Germany it's Kaiserslautern and Cologne are multiple mergers of clubs. They've won Bundesliga titles, so and German cups played in Europe. So it's not just an English thing, and I think it depends on the sport. I think it depends on how well, how not on the financial side, but on how the club structures work, and then making sure you get the right one of the stadiums as the home ground, merging the various youth systems together. Also, having the fans on board does help. Having the fans on board and making sure. Oh God, no, no, that would never happen ever. That would be mayhem. But no, there's been discussions about merging certain clubs who are rivals together, or ground sharing certain clubs together, and it doesn't come to fruition because they've done it in the NRL. Some of the dual ventures are still going. One of them isn't. So West Tigers, for example, is a basket case of a rugby league club, whereas the St George Illawarra Dragons, you could argue, have had more sustained success, but they're not doing much better. And the Northern Eagles lasted 4 years before Sydney Bears separated from the Manly Warringah Sea Eagles. Well, FC United Manchester, I think they've been pretty successful from where they started from. Very similar story to uh, Solihull Moors, really, in the sense of they've only been around for less than 20 years. Um, I would argue that I think, yeah, but Manchester Rovers, does it really work? Or Salford United? FC United of Manchester, I think that's basically a massive dig at the Glazers. Now, with any potential takeover, will that mean that they cease to exist? No, I think actually now the seeds have been set where they've got their own club. They, yeah, they are. They are serious in the non-league, and they have progressed through the non-league ladder. And um, the people who set up, the angry fans who set it up, I think, believe that fan involvement is very, very crucial to running a football club. And anyone who comes in to financially support the football club as a majority stakeholder would have to have that 50+1 rule with the fans having a big say in how the club's run as a majority or minority stakeholder of 49 or 51%. Um, so, um, yeah, they are serious, and they're not going away um, at all. And the non-league, they're quite well run. They're not quite at the level I think they want to be. I noticed the other day Colwyn Bay have made the Welsh Premier, taking some time since they switched. Yeah, there's no money in Welsh domestic football outside of the big clubs involved in the English league system, and that's the problem. Um, Wrexham, look at the struggles they've had since they fell out of the Football League. They've had money problems since falling out of the Football League. It's only the fact that Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney have got involved and the club is doing as well as they are and are looking like re-entering the Football League very, very quickly. I think Colwyn Bay, yeah, they didn't want to switch, but I think they were going to fold. They're going to fold either way. There's just not the money in the Welsh domestic game, and they couldn't really sustain themselves. They couldn't attract players. They're not going to attract fans now. Um, no, you could argue the news headlines. I think the way the club is run with the fan engagement and community engagement that both Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney have been very, very keen on is fan involvement. Um, Fans are now involved with the running of the club. Yes, they're the ones pumping the money in. They've invested a lot in the stadium redevelopment, so they can get back that international status as an international ground by FIFA and UEFA standards. And yeah, they bought the club for not a lot of money, but the rest of the money they're pumping into the local community, redeveloping the stadium, some of the players they've signed. No, I actually think it's been a positive. I think it massively benefits the Football League that they're on the verge of coming back, and it also massively benefits the Welsh national side, having four strong um, professional teams in the English league system in the top four divisions rather than three. Um, and I think it's a good thing. Press coverage, again, they're one of the few feel good stories to come out of football right now. It's more often that we're talking about managers getting sacked, negativity, player misbehaviour, corruption allegations. With Wrexham, it's the opposite. It's all about positivity. Um, so let that sink in. So yeah, I think that is very, very vitally important. And yeah, I think the last time we had four Welsh clubs was 6 months before I was born. So yes, 1989 I think would be it. And I wasn't even alive at the time, the end of the 88-89 season, because I'm born at the end of 89. So the 89-90 season would be my lifetime. So yeah, it's been my lifetime since we've had 4 Welsh clubs in a healthy state playing in the top 4 levels of the English system. Um, and we could argue whether that benefits or harms Welsh football that the best Welsh clubs play in England rather than Wales. But unfortunately, Welsh professional sport is not in a healthy state at club level. Rugby union, rugby league, and football. The fact that the top Welsh clubs play in a foreign league system, basically, which is England, says a lot about the state of domestic sport in Wales. I think it benefits Welsh football. I think having, hopefully, one day we might see further Welsh clubs decide actually the English league system is the way to go to go down that path of Newport and Wrexham, Swansea and Cardiff. But actually, this is the right way to go and gain investment and gain eyes on the product and to attract fans and attract players. But again, also barring and blocking the Welsh clubs that play in the English league system and those English clubs that technically border Wales, like the Bristol clubs and Shrewsbury, for example, from playing in the Welsh Cup, I think has also set Welsh football back in the long term. And it's obviously more recently that we've just got a good crop of really good Welsh players over the last 10, 15 years that have been playing in the top level in England and across Europe with Aaron Ramsey and Gareth Bale and Joe Allen. It is what it is. No, well, look at Scotland's struggles in Scottish football, with the quality level, and with only outside of Rangers and Celtic, Aberdeen, Hibs, Hearts, really 5, maybe Motherwell, 6 clubs that you could argue if they were to enter the English league system could be reasonably competitive off the get-go, whatever league they end up deciding to be placed in. 5, 6 clubs that really could battle in the English league system. Maybe Celtic and Rangers could be lower level Premier League clubs. I mean, that's where I think, Wales struggling, Scotland just about head above water, really. Tells you all you need to know. I think the Welsh league system is actually below the Northern Irish and Irish league systems for quality. So that Wales has problems with its professional sport and semi-professional sport outside of the full rugby union. Well, the GAA being amateur, the Gaelic Athletic Association being amateur, is also a social standpoint and a political standpoint. That's not just on the amateur status being because they can't afford it. Okay, they don't get the revenues. They only get 60 million euros. Last time I actually found the latest figures, I think it was from 2017. But there's also that social impact aspect and the political side of it as well. So I let that sink in. No, I think Motherwell and the 2 Dundee clubs for fan base could generate the revenues to be sustainable. No, Linfield will not join the English league system. But again, not even half the Scottish Premiership, I think, would make a good fist of it in the English league system with their history. I mean, you could argue St Mirren as well to a certain aspect, maybe Partick, with where they're placed in Scotland. But in reality, Celtic and Rangers, I think they've got the fan backing to be classed as big clubs. But in reality, I would say Celtic and Rangers would be fighting relegation in the Premier League every season, as things currently stand. Now, yes, we could argue that if you merge the Scottish league systems into the English league system, then yes, ultimately finances would improve, gate receipts would improve, and obviously going north and south across the border would be kind of that epic away trip. But it wouldn't happen overnight. And with how Scottish finances are right now and the teams they can assemble right now, their best talented players will be poached by wealthier clubs in England. And suddenly, I think they would drop into League One and Championship level, maybe League Two with some of the lower end Premiership and Championship Scottish clubs. And therefore, that's the level Scottish domestic football's at. You say that, but in reality, the quality of player that's coming through the Scottish domestic system, the best young Scottish talent gets noticed very, very quickly by the English league system. So your Andy Robinsons, for example, and very quickly are snapped up. Or looking at it, some of the Scottish players now who play for the national side, as I say, yeah, they've been snapped up by a youth system when they're 16, 17. They've shown promise, and they're snapped up by an English club in the lower levels, like the Championship or League One, maybe League Two, and then a Premier League club notices them doing rather well. They might get promoted with that lower league club to the league above. Scouts notice them. They're on lower wages. They don't cost as much, and they're bought cheaply, and then they move on for bigger money later on. Very few Scottish players now are currently playing outside of Scotland, or even England for that matter. It is. It's a shame, and unfortunately, I think it is having now a massive negative impact. There's a reason why Scotland have only qualified for one major international tournament since 1998. I mean, that tells you all you need to know. The UEFA coefficient goes against them. Their lack of, I mean, okay, the Rangers did make a European final. They lost that European final. Rangers made 2 European finals in the last 14 years, but 14 seasons, should I say, before this one. But in reality, the UEFA coefficient goes against them. The lack of competitiveness in the Scottish League since the mid '80s goes against them, and the precarious financial situation since the collapse of ITV Digital and Setanta doesn't help either. Literally, if you drop a couple of, you couldn't say, let's say the Old Firm is 2 games each, so 2 wins to each team, or a win each and 2 draws. The title race goes a little bit later into the season. Then you've got the domestic cups of the Scottish League Cup and the Scottish FA Cup, or the Scottish Cup as it's known. That's where like Hibs and Hearts and St Mirren and some of the other top flight clubs give Kilmarnock, St Johnstone give it a go. And it makes it a little bit interesting. But the last time a club not called Rangers or Celtic won the league title was Aberdeen. And I believe that was the year Alex Ferguson took the Man United job. His assistant stayed, I believe, and won another league title or some more silverware with Aberdeen. I think that was in the 85, 86 season. So the last season, the season after Fergie leaves, they win one more league title. And then suddenly it stopped. So, yeah, the best part, 37 years ago was the last time, I believe, a club not called Rangers or Celtic won the Scottish title. There's your problem. And it's quite an unfortunate problem. And the 80s was 70s and 80s, ironically, was very, very competitive in Scotland. Hence why the national side of Scotland was very good as well. But since the mid 80s, yeah, Aberdeen obviously losing Fergie to Man United was the death knell of Scottish club football, in my opinion. Quality of it. And then obviously, I think the European ban on English clubs, I think, benefited Scotland until about the mid 90s, and then suddenly English players don't play in Scotland anymore. At least top level English players. A handful have obviously gone up to Scotland at various points and played for the national side and played in the Premier League. But in reality, top level English players don't play in Scotland anymore. And English clubs are allowed to rejoin the European competitions. Suddenly, we see all the English players return home, and a handful of English players have played in other clubs in Europe since the lift on the ban of English clubs, and then suddenly Scottish football just goes down the shitter. Yeah, that wouldn't be well. Liverpool did basically win it for the best part of 20 years. Really, Liverpool were the dominant club for the best part of 20 years, but it wouldn't be good. It would not be good. And you could argue Man United's dominance in the first half of the Premier League era, from 1992 through to around 2013 when Fergie stepped down. For the best part, they won 13 titles in 21 seasons. Didn't help English football either. It was very good for Man United. Wasn't very good for English football. But Liverpool winning all these league titles between the 60s and the 80s, ironically, to begin with, it's not a problem because England win the 66 World Cup and they get Italia 90 to a semi-final. but in reality, it had a knock-on impact for a while as well. Um, I think you would have possibly Motherwell and maybe the Dundee clubs, and maybe Partick, because Partick historically are very, very good. Forget that. And possibly St Johnston. It would possibly be a right. It would be more interesting, I think. Um, but at the same time, it's kind of worrying where Scottish clubs are at right now. And when I get to do more club histories, I will focus on Scotland, and I will say, look, historically, Queen's Park were the big club in Scotland until Rangers win um, their first league title, and then it changes. Queen's Park until about the 1900 were the big club in Scotland. Uh, they're the reason why we have Hampden Park, and then it all uh, changes. I would say the way to solve Scottish football's problem is to combine the top two divisions and also combine the second and third tiers, and so you have a two division professional structure, and suddenly the issues change because you've got to play each team twice rather than four times, and you make it more competitive. But that's my opinion. Um, but a lot of clubs, Scottish football's in a right mess, and the fact that they are resisting um, the English clubs have decided to do with regards. No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I wouldn't. Well, the SPFL don't want that, but I think fans would. I think fans would buy into that. I think that would massively help Queen of the South or Queen's Park. Well, help Queen's Park. Queen of the South not so much, but Queen's Park maybe. Um, the fans would want that. I don't think the SPFL would want that because it means they have more members in the top flight that would argue in favour of strengthening the club's interests. Keeping the clubs weak is where the SPFL gets their power, and is why Scottish football is in such a poor state. Um, Having the leagues at a weak level allows the Scottish FA and the SPFL to have too much power. It also means that Rangers and Celtic basically get to bully other clubs into their point of view. Um, how many teams will I have in the SPL? I would say maybe 14 or 16. 16, I think, would be a lot more competitive, but then you would have to restructure the lower divisions to suit. And I would also change how they do promotion relegation as well with their playoff structure to the English system. I think that would benefit them. They haven't got enough talent. I would say 16 teams would definitely improve the competitive nature, and I would also reduce it from playing each other four times to twice, and restructure the domestic cups to suit. But I don't think Scottish fans think the way that the game is structured with promotion relegation playoffs is a shambles. It does. It is a shambles. I would say a 16-team top flight, a 16-team second flight, and 16-team leagues would definitely help. Just means you'd have to reintroduce a couple of the teams that have slipped into the Highland League and the Lowland League back into what is now Scottish League Two. And I would fight for a better TV deal. I would. I would fight for a better TV deal, and also expand how many teams qualify for Europe. It would mean teams would have to really fight for that European place. But then you would have to argue that the UEFA coefficient is actually harming Scottish football. And then Scottish FA would have to go to the UEFA and say your coefficient is actually hampering our league and our player development and our club's finances rather than helping it. So there is that. But I'm not involved with the. I'm just a YouTuber, but look. My view on European club football is get rid of group stages, go back to the old school straight knockout format, bring back the Cup Winners' Cup, get rid of Conference League, um, and revalue the domestic cup competitions and revalue some of the completely scrap the UEFA coefficient. League champions go into the Champions League. I would say runners up go into the Europa League, and the cup winners going to a cup winners' cup. There you go. 3 teams qualify for Europe. If the league champions also are win both domestic cups, so a domestic treble, for example, then obviously then the runners up in cup and league would go into those various things. And I would do that for a lot. I would re-incentivize the domestic cup competitions rather than having leagues scrapping their league cups and getting rid of replays. I would revalue and re-incentivize winning a domestic cup competition. I would actually re-incentivize making Europe by qualification, for example, and make it harder to qualify for Europe. Therefore, it actually incentivizes teams to really actually compete longer into the season or give a cup run a real consideration. And it would mean more value also to get rid of the dead rubbers that no one wants in the Champions League, Europa League, and Conference League. There's so many dead rubbers when you're out of it. Also, look at the group stage now. The third place team or something in the Champions League drops down. That devalues the Europa League. I would stop that. I would say you enter this competition. That's the competition you're in. That's the competition you stay in. That'll be it. But that would cost you for a little bit of money. Selling the TV packages, because I will have got X amount of games that the broadcasters can broadcast. No, they chase the money over the product, so they've gone for quantity over quality. They've saturated. They've caused all this fixture congestion that we hear about, and they've allowed the European Super League idea to gain traction. Because they keep folding to the clubs where they basically give in to the club demands of how they want the European calendar structured. That's the club owners, that's the money men and women in some cases who count the coin. In reality, fans don't want it. It's the club owners that want it because it makes they get a share of the revenue. So the clubs are responsible for the shambles that is European structures of the club competitions in Europe. And it's greed chasing money over quality. They chase the money. They continue to chase the money because now the players are getting higher wages than ever. The transfer fees are extortionate, and the agents are really raking it in every transfer. Well, we'll see what happens. But the proposed format that hasn't technically been signed off yet, the Swiss model, it doesn't. It won't work. It'll be a shambles, and very, very quickly away from the clubs go, this is a bad idea. While we're making all this revenue, fans hate it. They're not turning up to games. We're not getting the ticket revenue from the Champions League, Europa League, Conference League, that kind of thing. When fans really start turning away from games, and there's lots of empty seats, which we already see at Champions League and Europa League games in the group stages anyway. When that starts impacting the early knockout stages, those lucrative winner-takes-all two-headed legs, those ties, 2 matches. When we're starting to see fans staying away from the knockout stages in large numbers, and those tickets not getting sold, and a TV viewership drop off, that's when I think you may see a revert to actually simplify the format. They've overcomplicated the format every time, and it's designed to maximise revenue over enjoyment. The dead rubbers are pointless, but again, it's another game you can sell. It's more tickets you can sell, but in reality, empty seats are pretty crap TV. So there you go. But that's my opinion on it. I think we already have too many teams in the Champions League, Europa League, and Conference League. I think they've devalued the domestic cup competitions, and in reality, they've also devalued the European competitions. And we always get the same 16 to 20 teams in the latter stages on a regular basis. Whereas in the old formats, you had those shocks where a team will go on a cup run who are unfancied, that underdog, and end up winning. You don't get that anymore. So there's that. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts in below, and we'll have some more content for you. On that last question, West Ham could get relegated. Highly unlikely. I think they've got enough points in the bag now not to. But they could win a European trophy and get relegated. That is still a possibility. Mathematically, highly unlikely. I think they're more likely to win the Conference League and get relegated. If they do both, that would be ridiculous. I don't think that's been done before. I think, no, looking back on it, the FA Cup with Wigan and the League Cup with Birmingham City has happened before. Don't think a club's won a European trophy got to relegate from their domestic league before. Could happen. But I'm going to leave that there. Thank you very much, obviously, for watching. And I'll have some more content for you guys very, very soon.